Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're wandering back into a neighborhood that looked, from the curb, like the safest place a person could ever live. Not the version you remember from the reruns, with the laugh track and the perfectly reasonable father in his cardigan. I mean the actual place. The one humming with static electricity, sealed in vinyl siding, and quietly built on top of a few things nobody wanted to examine too closely. From the street it looked like the finish line of the American dream, the trimmed grass, the two-car garage, a roast defrosting on the counter since sunrise. But that dream had a crawlspace, and the crawlspace had its own opinions. So before you settle in, if you're the type who enjoys a slow wander through a strange corner of history, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if it actually suits you, no pressure either way. And a genuine thank you to whoever dropped the suggestion for tonight's theme in the comments, because this channel really does grow out of what you bring to it. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the clock says where you are, because it always seems to be just a bit too late somewhere on this planet. The show is also streaming on Spotify now if you'd rather drift off there, link waiting for you below. And for those who want the night to stretch on longer, there's an extended 8-hour ambient cut available to members. No breaks, just the quiet hum of the story continuing while you sleep. Now go ahead, lower the lights, click on a fan for that soft, steady hiss, get yourself comfortable, and maybe glance at your smoke detector on the way, because in the world we're about to enter, a startling number of those things were sitting there empty. Let's slow down for just a moment before we step inside. Have you ever really pictured what it was like to live inside that shag-carpeted fantasy? Did anyone genuinely believe a lawn needed that much chemistry poured onto it? Was every grown adult quietly running on drip coffee, static cling, and a small amber bottle tucked behind the mirror? Could you have lasted a single decade where dinner came in a compartmentalized tray, the living room air had a permanent blue tint, and the evening news calmly hinted the whole world might not survive the week? Would you have made it through one ordinary Tuesday afternoon as a child alone in an empty house, keys on a string around your neck, in a home that might have been slowly working against you in ways nobody could smell or suck? And now, congratulations. You've just opened your eyes in 1984. Your alarm clock has a single volume, and that volume is alarm. The room folding in around you is lined in warm wood paneling, the kind that turns any bedroom into a cedar sauna somebody built with real devotion. Underneath you, a waterbed shifts in size as you sit up, because yes, you are sleeping on a heated vinyl bladder filled with lukewarm water, and yes, an entire country agreed this counted as luxury. Sunlight is fighting its way through curtains the color of a mustard stain nobody's mentioning. Outside your window, house after identical house lines up in every direction, each one guarded by a flawless lawn and a door that's been locked since before anyone woke up. This is the suburb, calm on the surface. Almost nothing calm about what's underneath. You swing your feet down onto carpet so thick and so deeply brown it feels less like flooring and more like wadding into an overgrown field somebody forgot to mow. It's warm in a way carpet has no business being warm, having quietly absorbed a decade's worth of things you'd rather not think too hard about. The house holds that particular early morning stillness, a low electric murmur running underneath everything. The refrigerator, the furnace, a half-dozen appliances that apparently never fully switch off. Down the hallway, a clock radio clicks over to a station leaning hard on a saxophone solo, because in this decade, the saxophone appears to be contractually obligated in roughly a third of every song played. You stand, stretch, and catch your elbow on a dresser that's technically wood in the same way a stage prop is technically a castle, answering your bump with a hollow, sawdust-scented thud. Your bedroom is basically a small museum exhibit of this exact moment in time. There's a poster taped crookedly to the wall, held up by tape that will absolutely take the paint with it someday. A beanbag chair slumps in the corner, having quietly given up on holding any shape at all sometime last winter. A lava lamp glows on the nightstand, still warming up, its lazy blob of wax rising and sinking, with the patience of something that genuinely has nowhere else to be. The whole room is built to feel cozy, and it succeeds, in the exact way a very comfortable trap succeeds. You shuffle toward the door and catch your reflection in the mirror on the way past. There you are, a person about to walk, cheerfully and completely unaware, into a day that's been quietly rigged in a dozen small ways you can't yet see. You look fine. You feel great. This was the era's real specialty. The thing it did better than any decade before it. It made danger look exactly like decorating. It dressed up a slow accumulation of trouble as a perfectly nice place to live. Because from where you're standing, framed in your bedroom doorway, the morning really does look lovely. The light is gentle. The saxophone is trying its best. The street outside is spotless, green, and dead still, like a photograph of contentment nobody quite finished developing. You don't know yet that your cereal is basically a candy bar in a bowl. You don't know the air carries a faint chemical undertone. You don't know the lawn is a small-scale chemistry experiment, or that the pipes running through your walls might be lined with something better left unnamed. You just know it's morning, the coffee smells ready, and downstairs the day is waiting for you with a smile on. So you step out into it, blissfully unbothered, which is exactly how the whole neighborhood preferred to start its mornings in 1984. But before we head down to that kitchen, we need to talk about the house itself. Because your dream home had a hobby, and gardening wasn't it. Chapter 1. The house that had a hobby before your foot even hits the bottom stair. Let's talk about the structure wrapped around you while you slept. Because your cozy dream house had a hobby, and that hobby was slow, patient harm. The pipes overhead may be wrapped in asbestos. The window frames are very possibly finished in lead paint, a substance the era's children treated like a sweet treat. Underneath the basement slab, radon gas seeps quietly upward, colorless, odorless, utterly undetectable, simply doing its business. The particle board dresser in your room, the laminate bookshelf down the hall, all of it is slowly exhaling formaldehyde into the air you're breathing right now. None of it announces itself. None of it has a smell you'd notice. That was the whole trick of it. Your house wasn't some fanged monster crouched in the dark. It was a monster with a 30-year mortgage, and it had absolutely nowhere else to be. Start with the asbestos, the wonder material of its age. It was tucked into insulation, wrapped snugly around plumbing like a friendly little sweater, sometimes pressed into ceiling tiles, occasionally woven directly into flooring. It was praised rightly for being essentially fireproof. What went unmentioned, because nobody had printed it anywhere in plain language yet, was that disturbing it released fine fibers that had no business anywhere near a pair of lungs. So it sat there, soft and patient, waiting for some future renovation project to finally set it loose into the air. Then there's the lead paint, brushed on in cheerful glossy coats across every windowsill and doorframe in the house. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Lead paint has a faintly sweet taste. Small children, being small children, discovered this fact entirely on their own and treated the nearest windowsill like a dessert cart. Parents scolded them for it the way you'd scold a kid for gnawing on a crayon, mildly, absent-mindedly, with absolutely no idea that the crayon in question was quietly rewiring a developing brain. It's a bit like finding out the wallpaper had been seasoned the whole time. You can only hope nobody got too hungry. Below the floorboards in the dark, radon does its unhurried work. It rises out of the soil and bedrock beneath the foundation, seeps up through the concrete, and pools invisibly in the lowest rooms of the house, which is naturally exactly where the family liked to spend its evenings. It has no color. It carries no smell. It offers no warning whatsoever. It's a ghost that pays no rent, makes no sound, and simply stays. You would never have known it was there, because knowing was never really on the table, and your furniture is quietly in on it too. That handsome particle board entertainment center, that laminate coffee table, that whole bedroom set that reads as real wood if you don't look too closely, all of it is slowly breathing formaldehyde into the room. A chemical perfume so ordinary that nobody thought to ask a single question about it. New furniture smell was simply the smell of a new house. It's the difference between thinking, ah, fresh paint, and actually meaning, ah, a very low-grade industrial haze. The real genius of the whole arrangement was that none of it made a scene. No drama, no alarm bell, no ominous creak on the stairs. The dangers were odorless, invisible, and endlessly patient, content to work on a timescale of decades rather than nights. You could live your entire comfortable life inside a house like this and feel perfectly safe the whole time, which, to be fair, is exactly what nearly everyone did. So the house sat there, tidy and warm and beautifully furnished, quietly doing its arithmetic in the background. It didn't want to frighten you off. It wanted you to stay. And you did happily for years, breathing it all in without giving it a second thought, which is a strangely comforting note to carry with us as we finally head down to the kitchen, where the morning's first proper meal is waiting to have a quiet word with your bloodstream. Chapter 2. Breakfast has opinions about your bloodstream. You pour yourself a bowl of cereal engineered by people in white coats to be roughly 40% sugar and 100% cartoon mascot. It turns the milk a shade that doesn't occur anywhere in the natural world, and afterward you drink that milk like you've earned a medal. Beside the bowl sits a glass of orange drink that has, strictly speaking, never once encountered an actual orange, powdered into existence, then reconstituted with tap water. Maybe there's toast too, spread with margarine, a product science had very recently and very confidently declared the smarter choice over butter. Everything on the table is either the color of a manila folder or the color of a highlighter, with nothing much in between. You eat all of it cheerfully, because in 1984, the whole concept of nutrition is treated mostly as a rumor. Take a good look at the cereal box itself, a small cardboard cathedral of persuasion. A grinning mascot beams out from the front, usually some cartoon animal or wizard or improbably energetic sea captain, all of them thrilled beyond words about the sugar situation. The back offers a maze, a comic strip, and a mail-away offer for a plastic prize that will take 6 to 8 weeks to arrive and roughly 4 seconds to snap in half. The cereal itself is dyed in shades that suggest less a food product and more a small laboratory mishap. You eat 3 bowls. Nobody stops you. The milk left behind at the bottom, now tinted pink or grey or a faint radioactive green depending on the brand, is the true reward, and you tip the bowl straight to your mouth like an athlete rehydrating after a race. The milk was always the real point of the cereal. Then there's the orange drink, and let's be exact about the wording because the label certainly was. It is a drink, not a juice, a distinction some very careful lawyer clearly insisted upon. It begins life as a fine, cheerful powder in a canister, and you spoon it into water and stir it into a beverage the precise shade of a traffic cone. Astronauts drank it, or so the commercials swore, and if it was good enough for outer space, it was certainly good enough for a Tuesday morning. It tastes like the general idea of citrus, described secondhand by someone who once glimpsed an orange from a passing car window. The toast, meanwhile, arrives wearing its margarine proudly. This was the era being genuinely proud of itself. Butter was old news. Margarine was the modern, forward-thinking choice, endorsed by confident men in lab coats on television. Never mind that the science would later perform a rather awkward and complete reversal on the matter. This particular morning, though, margarine is a small triumph of progress, a spreadable symbol of a country that trusted its experts and its food dye in roughly equal measure. Survey the whole table and you'll notice the color palette only ever runs 2 settings. There's the beige faction, the toast, the cereal flakes, the little pat of margarine, all the shade of an old manila folder. And there's the neon faction, the drink, the marshmallow bits, the jam, all glowing like something plugged directly into an outlet. There is no middle ground. There is no vegetable in sight. Somewhere on the counter a banana sits quietly turning brown, entirely ignored. And you eat every bit of it with real, uncomplicated enjoyment, because it tastes wonderful, and because nobody at this table has the faintest reason to think twice. The word additive hasn't yet become a warning label. The notion that breakfast might be a slow-motion trick hasn't crossed anyone's mind. It's simply food, and it's fun, and it comes with a toy. So you finish the last neon sip, wipe your mouth, and feel completely fueled for whatever the day has planned. The only other thing worth noticing in this kitchen is the air itself, which has taken on a faint blue tint that has absolutely nothing to do with breakfast. Chapter 3: The air itself. Let's talk about the air in this house, because you're about to spend the whole day breathing quite a lot of somebody else's cigarette. In this world, people smoke everywhere without a second thought, at their desks, in the car with the windows rolled up tight, in the waiting room at the doctor's office, and right here at your own breakfast table. Restaurants proudly maintain a smoking section and a non-smoking section, divided by absolutely nothing more solid than good intentions and a few extra feet of floor tile. Ashtrays sit out on coffee tables like a permanent piece of the decor. The curtains in the living room carry a faint amber tint, and so do the walls, and so, slowly and invisibly, do you. Nobody here frames any of this as a problem. It's simply the texture of the air, a soft blue haze drifting through every room like a kind of indoor weather. You'll get used to it, and that, of course, is exactly the trouble. The ashtray deserves its own moment of appreciation, because it really was treated as a legitimate piece of home decor, chosen deliberately to match the room the way you'd match a throw pillow. There were heavy-cut glass ones for the good living room, ceramic ones shaped like leaping fish for the den, and slim chrome-legged standing models for people who felt their smoking deserved its own furniture. Every coffee table had one. Every end table had one. Every desk in every office had one within easy reach. Guests arriving at a dinner party didn't ask permission to smoke. They simply asked where the ashtray was kept, because a house without one on hand was, by the unwritten rules of the era, a house that had quietly given up on being hospitable. The airplane cabin might be the single greatest marvel of this whole arrangement. You'd climb into a sealed metal tube, climb to 30-some thousand feet, and then a good portion of the cabin would light up simultaneously inside the one enclosed space on the planet you absolutely could not step outside of. There was, naturally, a smoking section, situated a generous several rows back from the non-smoking section, the two separated by the powerful, invisible authority of a line painted on the aisle carpet. It's a bit like designating one shallow end of a swimming pool as the section where nobody's allowed to add anything to the water. The intention, at least, was sincere. The physics of a shared cabin of recirculated air simply weren't consulted. Back at the office, a low haze tends to settle over every desk by mid-morning. Colleagues smoke through meetings, through phone calls, while typing up memos, the cigarette perched permanently in the corner of the mouth like some kind of standard-issue accessory. The family doctor smokes. The dentist smokes, occasionally between patients, occasionally somewhere close enough that you can tell. There's a real chance the very person urging you to take a deep breath during your checkup is holding a lit one at the time. Even the hospital, that supposed temple of good health, keeps ashtrays out in its own waiting rooms, because where else, really, would a worried relative go to sit with their nerves? And so everyone in this world grows accustomed to it, the way a person grows accustomed to any kind of weather. The smell works itself into the upholstery, into the carpet fibers, into the coats hanging by the front door, into your own hair by the time an ordinary evening winds down. Non-smokers rarely complain, partly because there's nowhere obvious to direct the complaint, and partly because the idea that the air in a shared room might belong equally to everyone in it hasn't quite arrived yet as a concept people reach for. The smoke is simply present, a communal atmosphere, a kind of humidity you happen to be able to see. The walls themselves keep an honest record of it. Paint a room a crisp, bright white, live in it a few years, then take down a picture frame that's been hanging in one spot the whole time, and there beneath it you'll find the original color, a pale, almost startling rectangle glowing against the amber tobacco tint the rest of the wall has slowly taken on. The entire house is, in its own quiet way, being cured like a piece of meat in a smokehouse. So, incidentally, is everybody living inside it, though that particular bill won't come due for a good while yet. Nobody sitting at this table would call any of it strange, and that's genuinely worth saying plainly, because the point here isn't to sit in judgment of the people who lived through it. They simply didn't have the information, and a good deal of that information was being actively kept from public view by people who profited handsomely from the haze staying exactly where it was. They lived inside a world tinted faintly blue and quite sincerely believed the air around them was clear. So you sit at the table, breakfast finished, breathing in the shared cloud that will drift through nearly every room you enter for the rest of the day. It's just the air. You hardly register it anymore. And now, faintly hazed and thoroughly fed, it's time to go get dressed, which turns out to be its own small adventure in the chemistry of things that catch fire easily. Chapter 4. Your wardrobe would like a word with the fire marshal. You reach into the closet and pull on garments made almost entirely of polyester, a fabric that doesn't so much burn as melt, bonding itself enthusiastically to skin at the very first hint of an open flame, like, say, a birthday candle. The colors are loud enough to have an opinion of their own. The patterns look like they're mid-argument. Everything crackles faintly with static the second you move. You'll spend the whole morning gently zapping doorknobs, the family cat, and anyone unlucky enough to hug you. The pants fit snugly in places pants were frankly never designed to fit snugly. Somewhere in the back of the closet lurks a leisure suit that will go on to haunt at least 2 future generations in old photographs. By the standards of the day, you look fantastic, and also faintly like a walking candle standing around in a house full of open flame. Start with the shirt, which makes a bold, geometric statement in a set of colors that really ought never to have met each other in polite company. There are diamonds. There are swirling shapes. There's a pattern that seems to shift slightly the longer you stare at it, which is either an ingenious bit of textile design or a mild early warning sign, depending how you choose to read it. The fabric itself is smooth, faintly plasticky to the touch, cool for the first 10 seconds and then mysteriously, stubbornly warm, holding onto heat and moisture with the loyalty of an old friend who simply won't take a hint. Breathability was never really on the design brief. Breathability in this particular decade was considered a bit of a cop-out. The collar, meanwhile, is enormous, not a mistake, not a personal quirk, but a genuine cultural consensus that collars ought to be roomy enough to achieve actual lift in a stiff wind, spreading wide across the chest like a bird coming in for a landing. You pop it up. You leave the top few buttons undone. You do all of this entirely on purpose, and you feel wonderful about the whole effect. Then come the trousers, cut for a very specific silhouette, snug through the hip and thigh with a level of commitment that borders on medical precision. Sitting down becomes a small negotiation. Bending over becomes a genuine gamble. The fabric produces a soft, whispering sound with every step, thigh brushing thigh in a gentle synthetic hush that trails you around like a rumor nobody's confirmed. And down at the ankle, the leg flares out dramatically, because a plain straight pant leg was, at the time, considered something close to a failure of imagination. The real showstopper, though, is the static. Polyester is a fabric that quietly dreams of being electric, and in dry indoor air, it more than delivers on that dream. Pull the shirt on over your head, and your hair rises to greet the ceiling on its own initiative. Reach for a metal doorknob and you get a small blue spark and a genuine jolt of surprise for your trouble. Hug a relative hello and you both flinch at the same moment. Reach down to pet the cat and the cat, wisely, relocates itself elsewhere. For a few minutes each morning, you are, functionally, a small mobile weather event. Then the socks, white, pulled nearly to the knee, occasionally striped at the top for a bit of flair, worn confidently with absolutely everything, including shorts, including sandals, in combinations that later decades will study with a mixture of horror and grudging respect. Over these, perhaps a pair of gleaming white sneakers, or shoes with a heel that clacks with real satisfaction against tile flooring. The true risk hiding in all of this is the melting point. Natural fibers, when they meet an open flame, tend to burn and reduce fairly gently to ash. Synthetic fabric behaves quite differently. It softens, it liquefies, and it does not politely detach itself from the skin underneath. In a decade filled with ashtrays on every table, candles on every birthday cake, and a lit cigarette in roughly every third hand you might shake, dressing head to toe in the stuff was, quietly, a sporting proposition. Nobody thought about it directly. You simply learned by instinct rather than instruction to keep a certain healthy distance from the birthday candles. But standing in front of the mirror right now, none of that crosses your mind at all. You look sharp. You look thoroughly modern. You look, frankly, incredible, a shimmering polyester monument to confidence in some genuinely questionable material science. You give the collar one last adjustment, zap the doorframe gently on your way out, and head for the driveway, where the family car is waiting to introduce you to the concept of pure, uncalculated statistical luck. Chapter 5. The Driveway and the Gamble of the Family Car. Down in the driveway waits the family car, roughly the size of a small boat, drinking leaded gasoline and exhaling a fine mist of it into every neighborhood it rolls through. Seatbelts technically exist, but buckling one is treated as a quirky personal habit, not unlike collecting stamps or keeping a diary. The kids ride loose in the way back, that rear-facing bench seat tucked into the tail end of the station wagon, waving cheerfully at strangers with nothing at all between them and the open road, but a general sense of goodwill. Nobody here has heard of a car seat in anything like the modern sense. The dashboard is a solid, unyielding slab of metal. Driving after a few drinks gets discussed, when it gets discussed at all, as a stroke of bad luck rather than an actual decision somebody made. You climb in, buckle nothing, turn the key and simply hope for the best. Pretty much everyone did. The car itself really is a magnificent object, long and low and heavy as a small bank vault, upholstered in vinyl that reaches stovetop temperatures on a summer afternoon and walk-in freezer temperatures come winter, achieving anything resembling comfort on roughly 4 days out of the entire year. Sliding across that bench seat in shorts on a blazing July afternoon is its own small rite of passage, a genuine scorching initiation that teaches you, once and for all, to respect both the sun and the seat in equal measure. The fuel it runs on is leaded, and this particular detail is worth sitting with for a second. Lead was mixed into gasoline to help engines run a bit more smoothly, and it did exactly that, at the modest cost of releasing fine particles of lead into the air of every street, every driveway, every school pickup line in the country. Children breathed it in on the walk to class. Everybody breathed it in, really, without exception. The exhaust drifting out of millions of tailpipes was quietly seasoning the entire atmosphere overhead, and it would take years of sustained argument before anyone managed to pull it back out again. Inside the cabin, the safety features on offer are best described as aspirational. The dashboard is one solid painted slab of metal, positioned generously at exactly head height. The steering wheel is a rigid hoop of hard plastic, mounted on a firm column aimed with real conviction straight at the driver's chest. Airbags belong entirely to some future decade. The whole passenger compartment is, structurally speaking, a nicely decorated room built inside a 2-ton object hurtling along at speed, and the primary safety system in place is simply everyone agreeing, in theory, to be careful. Meanwhile, the children are having the time of their lives back in the way back, that rear-facing bench tucked into the very tail of the station wagon. They face the traffic trailing behind, waving at drivers following just close enough to make the whole arrangement interesting. There's nothing holding them in place. There's nothing between them and the tailgate but the tailgate itself. On a long road trip, they'll sprawl back there with pillows and comic books, sliding gently side to side on every turn, and this is considered by every kid in the car an absolute treat, the good seat, the coveted spot. Seatbelts do exist back there too, technically, tucked into the crease of the bench, buckle half swallowed by the upholstery, mostly left undisturbed. Clicking one on marks you out faintly as the nervous type. The prevailing wisdom of the day holds that a genuinely good driver simply doesn't crash, and that the belt is really there for people who lack a certain confidence, which is a bit like arguing a smoke detector is only for people who don't quite trust their own stove. And the drinking, we'll say this part plainly, because it's the part with the sharpest edge. Driving home after a few drinks is widely shrugged off, joked about, tolerated in a way that later decades will find genuinely hard to reconcile with common sense. The consequences, when they arrived, were catastrophic and permanent, and it took the tireless, painful work of grieving families to slowly, finally shift how the whole culture came to see it. That shift was real, and it mattered enormously, and it arrived far too late for far too many. So you settle into the boat-sized front seat, turn the key, and the big engine grumbles awake beneath a hood roomy enough to land a small aircraft on. You back out of the driveway wearing no seatbelt, trailing a faint lead-tinted cloud behind you, trusting the whole enterprise to luck, and most days, luck obliged. Now let's follow this car all the way to its actual destination, because somebody in this house is driving straight toward a job that's slowly working a hole into the lining of their stomach. Chapter 6. The job that's quietly eating someone alive. Somebody in this house puts on a tie, climbs into that same car, and drives off toward a job that is, in its own quiet way, eating them alive. The office runs on coffee, cigarettes, and a steady low hum of dread that everyone simply calls the economy. Layoffs land without warning. Loyalty flows in exactly one direction, and it is not toward the employee. The briefcase is heavy. The commute stretches on. And the words stress and burnout haven't yet been invented as polite, socially acceptable excuses. So instead, people quietly develop ulcers, chest pains, and a nervous little twitch instead. The prize for surviving all 30 years of it is a gold watch, assuming the company is even still standing by then. You loosen your collar in the parking lot and walk in smiling, because appearing perfectly fine is, in the end, most of the actual job. The office itself is a sea of beige cubicles under humming fluorescent light, a landscape of metal desks, rotary phones, and a coffee machine that never once seems to sleep. The carpet is industrial grade, and the color of an oncoming rain cloud. The overhead lighting buzzes at a pitch just below what you'd consciously notice, a sound your body quietly registers as a low, mild unease for 8 straight hours a day. On every desk sits a full ashtray, a stone-cold cup of coffee, and a stack of paperwork that seems to reproduce faster than any one person could ever hope to clear it. The fuel that runs this whole place is caffeine and nicotine, consumed in roughly equal and genuinely enormous quantities. You drink coffee that's been sitting on a hot plate since well before dawn, thick and bitter enough to strip a layer of varnish, and you drink it steadily all day, because the day is long and the meetings are longer still. Between cups, you smoke at your desk, in the elevator, occasionally right in the middle of a meeting, and the whole floor shares one continuous, slow-drifting cloud that hangs lazily just beneath the ceiling tiles. The pressure here is a genuinely physical thing. There's a boss somewhere down the hall who firmly believes fear is a legitimate management style, and that looking exhausted is functionally the same thing as looking dedicated. Working late isn't so much encouraged as quietly expected, enforced with a raised eyebrow aimed at anyone who dares leave while the sun's still up. Taking an actual lunch break is treated as a bit of a personal weakness. Taking a sick day requires roughly the paperwork of a small mortgage application. The message, never quite spoken aloud, is that you're lucky to have this metal desk and this rain-cloud-colored carpet at all, and that 100 other people would happily take your place tomorrow if you so much as stumbled, and the loyalty, again, only ever runs one direction. You're expected to hand the company your years, your evenings, your health, your ulcer. In exchange, the company reserves the full right to eliminate your entire department on a random Friday afternoon with nothing more than a memo and a cardboard box. Layoffs sweep through without warning, and the people who survive them go quiet for a week or two, then double down, working even harder, smiling even wider, quietly terrified of being next on the list. Nobody here has quite the vocabulary yet for what this does to a person over time. The idea that burnout might be something real, something the body and mind genuinely suffer from, hasn't fully entered the culture. So the damage shows up sideways instead, in chest pains that get waved off, in ulcers treated with a chalky pink liquid, and a healthy dose of denial, in the man who comes home tight-jawed and silent, pouring himself something stiff before he's even managed to shrug off his coat. It gets carried privately, because carrying it privately was considered the appropriately manly thing to do, and that too, quietly, exacted its own cost. The grand reward for enduring the whole 30-year run is that gold watch, handed over at a modest little ceremony, a small shining symbol of a lifetime of loyalty. It was meant to represent a genuine partnership. Increasingly, it came to symbolize something closer to a punchline, as more and more of those 30-year companies quietly vanished, merged, or downsized long before the watch was ever properly engraved. So you square your shoulders out in the parking lot, take one last breath of free air, loosen the collar one final notch, and walk in beaming, because looking fine really was 90% of the job, and the actual work was the other 90% on top of that. And while you're inside grinding through it back at home, somebody else is waging a very different kind of war out on the front lawn, fully armed with an arsenal of chemistry. Chapter 7: The War for the Perfect Lawn. Let's talk about the lawn, that small green rectangle of grass a certain kind of man was, quite genuinely, prepared to go to war for. Achieving that flawless, uniform carpet of green required an honestly alarming amount of chemistry. You spray it, dust it, and soak it thoroughly in herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers carrying names that sound like minor movie villains. Then, roughly 20 minutes later, you send your children and the family dog out to roll around on it barefoot. A fair number of these compounds were close cousins to substances that would later be banned outright. The whole goal was a lawn so flawless it looked almost artificial, a velvet moat of conformity standing between you and the neighbors. You mow it in perfectly straight lines, breathe deeply, and feel a real swell of pride. The grass, all the while, is quietly the single most poisoned living thing on the entire property, and it has competition for that title. The lawn, in truth, was never really about the grass at all. It was about the message the grass sent. A flawless green rectangle announced to the entire street that a responsible, prosperous, well-ordered person lived inside that house, someone with the time, the money, and the discipline to keep their whole life as tidy as their turf. A patchy, uneven lawn, by contrast, whispered that something might be going wrong behind the front door, and in a neighborhood built almost entirely on appearances, that particular whisper simply could not be allowed to spread. So the war was waged with a genuine arsenal. There was the herbicide to kill the weeds, the pesticide to kill the insects, the fungicide to kill the fungus, and the fertilizer to force whatever survived to grow far faster than nature ever intended. Each product arrived in a sack or canister, decorated with cheerfully reassuring artwork and instructions printed in a font size that actively discouraged actually reading them. You spread it, sprayed it, watered it in, layering compound on top of compound until the soil beneath the lawn resembled less an ecosystem and more a home chemistry set. The dandelion stood as the sworn enemy, a cheerful yellow flower that most of the natural world considers a genuine gift to the bees, and that the average suburban homeowner considered a deeply personal insult. Its appearance triggered an immediate response, a targeted strike with a spray bottle, followed by a grim little satisfaction as the offending plant curled up and browned and finally died off. Peace in the yard meant one single approved species stretching wall to wall, uniform as carpeting, and any deviation from that was hunted down with something close to genuine zeal. Here's the detail that lands strangely in hindsight. You treat the lawn first thing in the morning, soaking it in a fine toxic mist, and that very same afternoon, the kids would be out there turning cartwheels across it, and the dog would be sprawled happily in the middle of it, and everybody would be barefoot, faces pressed right down into the grass that had been chemically assaulted only a few hours earlier. Nobody connected those two events at all. The lawn looked clean, and clean was clean, and the fact that clean had been achieved through fairly serious industrial means simply never registered. Some of the products lined up on those garage shelves contained ingredients that would, in later years, be studied closely, questioned publicly, restricted, and in more than a few cases pulled from shelves entirely. At the time, they were sold cheerfully at the hardware store, sitting right next to the grass seed and the garden hoses, with no more ceremony than a bag of mulch. The confidence of the whole era was total. If a product made the lawn greener, it was good, and if it was sitting on a store shelf, it was safe, and those two beliefs were rarely, if ever, troubled by any actual evidence. And then there was the mowing itself, the sacred weekly ritual of it, done in careful overlapping stripes so the finished lawn carried the crosshatched pattern of a baseball outfield. The smell of fresh-cut grass mingling with gasoline exhaust in the warm afternoon air. The neighbor directly across the street doing precisely the same thing at precisely the same hour. Both of you nodding at each other. Both of you quietly measuring your own stripes against his. So you step back at last and survey your handiwork, a flawless emerald rectangle gleaming under the afternoon sun, and you feel the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of a job done exactly right. It's beautiful. It's perfectly uniform. And it is, without much competition, the single most heavily poisoned patch of ground for 100 feet in any direction, and you are prouder of it, this week at least, than of almost anything else you own. Chapter 8. The invisible game everyone was secretly losing. Across the street, the neighbors just brought home a brand new car, and so now somehow, you need one too. They put in a swimming pool last summer. They've got a video cassette recorder the size of a small suitcase sitting proudly in their living room. Every single purchase on this street is a quiet move in a silent game nobody would ever openly admit to playing. And the scoreboard, as it happens, is the driveway. The trouble is that most of it was running on a shiny new invention called consumer credit. Behind the two cars and the freshly painted siding sat a slowly growing mountain of debt, humming away quietly beneath the floorboards where nobody could see it. Everyone on this street looked prosperous. A great many of them were one missed paycheck away from the whole illusion folding up like a cheap lawn chair. The Joneses, as it happens, were never a specific family at all. They were everyone, and simultaneously no one, an abstract, ever-present neighbor who always seemed to have gotten to the next thing just a little before you did. A moving target of prosperity you could never quite catch up to. When they rolled home with a new car, it sat there gleaming in their driveway like a small public announcement, and you felt the old, familiar itch start up. Your own car, which had looked perfectly fine yesterday morning, suddenly looked tired, worn out, like it was letting the whole street down single-handedly. The battlefield, notably, was always the driveway, because the driveway was visible from the road. This was both the genius and the quiet cruelty of the whole arrangement. The things people competed over were, without exception, the things that could be seen from the street. The car, the boat parked beside the garage, the fresh coat of paint on the shutters, the shiny new gas grill wheeled proudly out for the whole neighborhood to admire on a Saturday afternoon. Nobody, notably, competed over the contents of their savings account, because nobody could actually see that. The scoreboard rewarded visible display, and so visible display is exactly what everyone went out and bought. And then there were the appliances. Oh, the appliances. The video cassette recorder arrived in people's living rooms like some kind of small spacecraft, a heavy, humming machine that could apparently pull entire television broadcasts straight out of thin air and play them back again whenever you liked. A genuine miracle of engineering that happened to cost roughly as much as a decent used car. To own one was, in a very real sense, to have arrived. To own a microwave on top of that, a second television set, a stereo system with speakers the size of nightstands, was to be winning visibly and undeniably against every neighbor who hadn't yet gotten their hands on these particular objects. The secret engine quietly powering all of this was consumer credit, and it was still fresh and shiny enough at the time to feel a bit like magic. The plastic card in your wallet meant you no longer had to actually possess the full amount of money before buying the thing you wanted. You could simply have the car now today, and pay it off slowly in small, manageable, endless monthly installments. A steady river of payments flowing off into a future that always seemed like it would sort itself out eventually. It was genuinely intoxicating. For the first time in a long while, it felt easy. And ease, when it comes to money, tends to be exactly the sort of thing worth being a little suspicious of. So the two-car garage kept filling up, and the credit card balance kept quietly climbing, and the beautiful, visible surface of prosperity grew a touch more beautiful with every passing year, while the invisible foundation underneath it all grew a touch more hollow. Families that looked from the curb to be sailing along in perfect comfort were, in plenty of cases, holding the whole gleaming picture together with monthly minimum payments and a lot of crossed fingers. The house was full of nice things. The margin underneath it all was paper thin, and the quiet strain of maintaining an image that cost more than you actually brought home went entirely unspoken, tucked neatly away with all the other things this particular neighborhood preferred not to say out loud. You wave cheerfully at the Joneses, compliment their gleaming new car through gritted teeth, and drive off to the dealership yourself to take a look at one just like it. And nobody, not once, ever admits to anyone else that the whole game has rules or a running score or a real cost attached, because the entire arrangement only keeps working as long as everybody keeps playing along, and nobody looks too closely at anyone else's actual books. One steady paycheck and the illusion holds together beautifully, indefinitely. One missed paycheck, one sudden layoff, one unexpected turn of events, and the whole gleaming structure can fold up fast and quiet, and the neighbors would never even know because you'd never tell them. That too was simply understood as one of the rules. Meanwhile, back inside all these carefully arranged houses, the children of this neighborhood are letting themselves in after school, every single afternoon, into entirely empty homes. And that particular arrangement deserves a full chapter of its own. Chapter 9. The Children Who Let Themselves In. Let's meet the kids of this neighborhood, or rather, let's try to, because more often than not, they're simply not home. You're what's known as a latchkey kid, which means you carry your house key on a length of string looped around your neck and let yourself into an entirely empty house every single afternoon after school, with several unsupervised hours stretching out ahead of you. There's no adult waiting, no check-in call, no glowing screen anywhere tracking where you are. Just you, a bowl of dry cereal eaten straight from the box, and whatever happens to be playing across the 4 available television channels. You're trusted, more or less by default, not to burn the house down, to answer the phone carefully in case it's a stranger on the line, and to keep the front door locked against the vague, ever-present menace the evening news keeps hinting at. For millions of kids growing up in this decade, this was simply ordinary life. It built a strange, early kind of independence in a whole generation, and also, quietly, a very specific kind of solitude that stuck around long after childhood ended. The key itself functioned as a kind of whole identity, worn on a shoelace or a length of yarn, tucked under your shirt, warm from your own skin by the time the school day ended. You did not lose that key, because losing it meant sitting alone on the cold front step until somebody finally came home, and somebody might not come home for hours yet. So you guarded that little metal object the way you'd guard an actual lifeline. Because in a very real sense, that's precisely what it was. The walk home from school was entirely yours, or perhaps shared for a stretch with a small knot of other kids, each one peeling off one by one at their own front door, disappearing into their own quiet, empty house. You'd let yourself in, and the place would greet you with a very particular kind of silence, the specific hush of rooms that have simply been sitting still, undisturbed, all day long. sunlight slanting low across the carpet, the refrigerator humming quietly away to itself in the kitchen. For a few hours each afternoon, you were, functionally, the sole occupant of the entire adult world, and that felt thrilling and faintly eerie in roughly equal measure. There were rules delivered well in advance and repeated often. Lock the door the second you're inside. Don't open it again for anyone, no matter who they claim to be. If the phone rings and it's somebody you don't recognize, don't say you're home alone. Say your parents are simply busy and can't come to the phone right now. A small, careful, well-rehearsed lie that practically every kid of this era had ready to go. Don't touch the stove. Stay out of the pool if nobody's around. Don't do the long, ever-growing list of things that could, left unsupervised, go badly wrong. And there was nobody there at all to enforce a single one of these rules except your own 8 or 9 or 10-year-old sense of judgment. And somehow, mostly, you managed. You poured a bowl of dry cereal or made yourself some toast or ate an entire stack of crackers standing right at the kitchen counter. You flipped on the television and worked your way through the after-school lineup, the cartoons, the reruns, 4 channels total, and a dial you had to physically turn by hand. You did your homework, or more often, you didn't. You built elaborate blanket forts. You staged long, involved scenarios with your action figures. You called a friend on the one shared phone line in the house. You wandered the neighborhood a little and came back before it got dark. The hours stretched out long and shapeless, and they belonged entirely to you. This arrangement built something genuinely real in a whole generation of children. A real independence, a real resourcefulness, a real comfort sitting alone with your own thoughts and figuring things out without an adult standing over your shoulder. You learned to make your own snacks, manage your own stretch of unsupervised time, and handle small emergencies without anybody around to hand them off to. There's a real strength that grew out of that, and plenty of the kids who lived it grew into adults who were quietly proud of just how self-sufficient they'd had to become at such a young age. But there was another side to it too, quieter, harder to put a name to. And it's worth saying plainly and gently that a lot of time spent alone at that age also left behind a particular kind of residue. A self-reliance that could shade over at times into something a little lonelier. An early lesson that you were, at bottom, fundamentally on your own. Plenty of kids from this era carry a very specific relationship with empty rooms and quiet afternoons even now. A familiarity with solitude that started young and never entirely left. It wasn't neglect, not really. Most of these parents were working hard, often both of them at once, simply trying to keep that heavily mortgaged dream afloat, and there genuinely wasn't another option sitting on the table. It was simply the arrangement of the time, and like most arrangements of that particular time, it quietly asked something of the children involved that nobody ever fully acknowledged out loud. So you sat there in the still afternoon light with your bowl of dry cereal and your 4 channels, the front door locked tight, the key warm against your chest, holding down the fort until the sound of a car finally pulling into the driveway broke the long quiet. You were fine. You were entirely capable. And you were also, in that moment, very small, inside a very empty house. And out past that locked front door, the backyard was keeping an entirely different set of surprises waiting for you, most of them made out of metal and pure, unchecked enthusiasm. Chapter 10. The backyard where fun and injury were the same activity. Step outside into the backyard, where fun and genuine bodily harm turn out to be essentially the same activity. Leading the list of hazards are lawn darts, heavy, foot-long metal spikes, weighted at one end and tapered to an honest point, that you hurl into the open air near other actual human beings, purely for entertainment, and which were marketed cheerfully to families with young children. Down the street, the neighborhood playground sits on a foundation of poured concrete, and features a metal slide that reaches surface temperatures that could reasonably rival the sun. The above-ground pool has a ladder held together with a combination of rust and pure optimism. The trampoline has no safety net, no padding anywhere along its steel frame, and a running wait list of kids eager to launch themselves clean off it. Safety, as a general concept, mostly existed as something you learned the hard way, through direct personal experience. You head outside to play, and the whole backyard quietly sharpens its teeth. Let's start with the lawn darts, because they genuinely deserve top billing here. These were not the soft, harmless plastic toys the name might suggest to modern ears. These were heavy, foot-long spikes, weighted solidly at one end and tapered to a real, functional point, designed specifically to be flung underhand high into the air and to land, quivering, in the grass near a target ring laid out on the ground. Children played this game. Children stood reasonably close to that target ring while other children hurled genuine metal spikes skyward at it. The basic physics of what goes up eventually having to come back down again was, apparently, considered somebody else's problem entirely. It's a bit like playing a friendly game of catch using an actual javelin and simply calling it a backyard pastime. The neighborhood playground down the block was its own small theater of consequence. The entire structure sat on a foundation of poured concrete or tightly packed gravel, because the cushioned wood chips and rubber matting of later decades hadn't yet occurred to anyone as a good idea. You'd fall from the monkey bars straight onto a surface offering all the give of a sidewalk, which is to say, none at all, and then you'd simply get back up and try it again. The equipment itself stood tall, taller than really seemed wise, built entirely out of steel and good intentions. The metal slide was, without question, the crown jewel of the whole arrangement. Left sitting in the summer sun for a few hours, it transformed into a gleaming silver griddle, hot enough to leave a genuine mark on the back of a child's bare legs. Every kid on that playground knew this fact perfectly well, and every kid climbed the ladder and went down it anyway, either lining the seat of their shorts with a jacket first, or simply accepting the sizzle as the small toll owed for the ride down. Then there was the above-ground pool, that great vinyl ring of summer joy, its water taking on a suspicious shade of green by the time August rolled around, its little filter running mostly on hope and good faith. The ladder used to climb in was a wobbling assembly of thin metal tubing and creeping rust, bolted together sometime before you were even born and inspected. As far as anyone could tell, never. Climbing in was already something of an adventure. Climbing back out, dripping wet and shivering, was a real test of nerve and grip strength on rungs that flexed noticeably under every step. And the trampoline, the true reigning monarch of the whole backyard arsenal. It stood tall and bare in the middle of the lawn, a taut black circle ringed by exposed metal springs and hard steel edges, with no safety net anywhere in sight and no padding whatsoever along its frame. The net, as a concept, belonged entirely to some distant future decade. The whole appeal of the thing, in fact, was the total absence of anything designed to stop you. Kids bounced in pairs, launching each other absurdly high into the air, and the explicit goal, more often than not, was to bounce a sibling clean off the edge and into the surrounding grass. Sprained ankles were basically seasonal. Broken arms were a story you knew personally, from somebody in your own class. The real genius of the whole backyard was that it taught you everything strictly through consequence. There was no warning label anyone ever bothered reading, no adult hovering nearby with a steadying hand ready to catch you. You learned the slide was scorching hot by getting burned on it exactly once. You learned the trampoline had a hard edge by eventually finding it the hard way. You learned, in 100 small and genuinely painful lessons, precisely how the physical world actually worked. And you carried the resulting scars and the resulting knowledge forward together, which is not really the worst way to learn something, just easily the most direct. So you head out into the sunshine and the low-grade danger, gloriously unsupervised, more than ready to hurl a metal spike, scorch the backs of your legs, or launch a sibling into orbit off the trampoline. And in that particular moment, you have honestly never been happier. And when the summer sun finally chased you back inside for the day, an entirely different kind of ritual was waiting for you, one that reached you not through the yard, but straight through the television screen, and it happened, without fail, every single Saturday morning. Chapter 11: Saturday Morning and the Gentle Art of Being Harvested. Let's talk about Saturday morning, those sacred, unhurried hours when children across the entire country sat cross-legged in front of the television and were gently, expertly, and very profitably harvested. The cartoons themselves were bright and genuinely wonderful, and nearly every single one of them existed at bottom to sell you a toy. The commercials came fast and loud, pushing sugar cereal, sugary drinks, and small plastic action figures your parents would soon find themselves hunting down at every single store in the county. Marketing directly at children wasn't merely allowed in this decade. It was a thriving, wide-open art form with essentially no rules attached and one very clear underlying goal. You didn't feel manipulated by any of it, not for a second. You felt pure, uncomplicated joy. That, of course, was rather the entire point. You were a very small consumer being lovingly and carefully trained, and on some quiet level, the training never fully wore off. The ritual itself always began early, earlier than any ordinary school morning, because on Saturdays, you woke yourself up entirely on your own initiative. You'd pad out to the living room still in your pajamas while the rest of the house slept on. Pour yourself a bowl of the good cereal, the one saved specially for weekends. Plant yourself down on the shag carpet at a distance from the television set your parents were always warning would eventually ruin your eyesight, and settle in for the only few hours of the entire week that belonged completely and exclusively to children. And the programming absolutely knew it. This was the one block of airtime that spoke directly and only to kids, and it made full, unapologetic use of the opportunity. The cartoons themselves were genuinely dazzling, a parade of heroes and robots and talking animals, each one anchoring its own little world with a full cast of characters you knew instantly by name. They were, without question, real fun. That part was essential. The fun was always the hook, and the hook, as it turned out, was set very deep, because sitting behind an alarming number of these shows was a very specific commercial purpose. Here was the era's quiet masterstroke. A great many of these cartoons weren't simply shows that happened, by coincidence, to have a toy line attached. They were toy lines that happened to have a cartoon built around them. A company would design an entire lineup of action figures or vehicles first, and only then commission a full animated series expressly engineered to make children want that exact toy line. The show itself was, functionally, a 30-minute advertisement wearing the costume of entertainment, and it was brilliant, and it was aimed squarely at an audience that had, in some cases, only just lost its first baby tooth. Then, wedged in between the cartoons, came the actual commercials, and these were a genuine craft all their own. Loud, fast, saturated in color, cut to a rhythm engineered to grab hold of a young developing brain and simply not let go. They sold cereal that promised, in careful legal language, to be part of a complete breakfast, a phrase doing an enormous amount of quiet work underneath the surface. They sold sugary drinks and candy. And above all, they sold the toys, filmed on elaborate sets with excited child actors and a booming, confident narrator, making a small piece of molded plastic look like the single most thrilling object currently in existence anywhere on Earth. And it worked completely, every single time. You'd catch sight of a toy on Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon you needed it with a want so pure and so total it eclipsed practically everything else in your small world. And then the campaign would begin in earnest. The pleading, the careful negotiating, the dragging of one exhausted parent after another from store to store in search of whatever exact plastic marvel the machine had successfully implanted in your head that very morning. The parents, for their own part, often gave in, partly because the wanting itself was so genuine and so overwhelming, and partly because simply saying yes was easier in the moment than holding the line. There were, in this era, essentially no meaningful rules restraining any of it. The idea that marketing aimed directly at small children might reasonably call for some kind of limit was still years away from taking hold anywhere in the culture. So the whole pipeline ran wide open, straight from the toy company, through the cartoon studio, through the commercial break, and directly into the soft, receptive mind of a child sitting on the floor eating cereal. And everyone involved in that entire chain knew exactly what they were doing, except, of course, for the child. But here's the honest part of it, the part that keeps this whole chapter from tipping over into something purely sinister. It genuinely did not feel like exploitation from down there on the carpet. It felt, unmistakably, like magic. Those Saturday mornings were, for millions of kids, pure and uncomplicated happiness, a warm little island of color and possibility floating in the middle of an otherwise ordinary week. And the memory of them stays golden even decades later, even once you fully understand as an adult exactly what was being carefully done to you the whole time. You were, without question, a tiny customer in training. And yes, you were also, genuinely and completely, having the very best morning of your entire week. So you sit there cross-legged in the glow of the screen, cereal bowl balanced in your lap, that particular want blooming quietly in your chest, perfectly and joyfully harvested. And when the cartoons finally wound down for the morning and that carefully planted want needed satisfying at last, there was exactly one obvious place the whole family would end up driving to, a vast, gleaming temple built for precisely that purpose. Chapter 12. The mall beating fluorescent heart of suburbia. Now let's drive over to the mall, the true beating fluorescent heart of the entire suburban world. It's climate-controlled, entirely windowless and deliberately designed so that you completely lose all sense of time passing. And none of that, incidentally, was an accident. Inside, a fountain gurgles away at the center court. A food court perfumes the whole building with the smell of frying oil, and packs of teenagers orbit the arcade like moths circling a porch light. The mall is where you shop, where you socialize, where you go on your first dates, where you quietly define yourself by which particular shopping bags you're seen carrying out the door. It feels, in this moment, like the very center of the universe and the shape of the future all rolled into one, gleaming and seemingly endless. Nobody standing inside it could have imagined that these very palaces would one day sit empty, echoing and dim. But right now, tonight, the mall is everything, a full temple to spending, and you have arrived to worship at it with your parents' credit card tucked safely in your pocket. The approach alone counts as an event in itself, an ocean of parking stretching out and baking under the sun, so genuinely vast that you have to jot down your row on a little paper ticket or risk wandering it helplessly for a solid hour afterward, trying every direction. Then come the doors, and then, all at once, the air. That first cool rush of conditioned atmosphere hitting you the moment you step through. An instant, artificial, seasonless climate that feels, on a scorching afternoon, like stepping directly into the future itself. Inside, the architecture works on you in ways you never consciously notice. There are no windows anywhere, so there's no sense at all of the sun moving across the sky outside. There are no clocks mounted on any wall, not one, anywhere in the entire building. This is a deliberate, calculated absence, meant specifically to unmoor you from time altogether, so that you'll linger and drift and browse and buy without ever quite noticing how long you've been at it. The lighting stays even and bright and entirely shadowless throughout. You could walk in at noon and walk back out at dusk, genuinely startled to discover the whole day had somehow gotten away from you, which is precisely the intended effect, engineered every bit as carefully as the layout of the individual storefronts. At the very center, there's often a fountain, tiled and burbling steadily, its surface glinting with 1,000 tossed pennies, a gathering point, a landmark, and a small civic miracle, all rolled into one. Around it fan out the storefronts level after level, connected by escalators and glass-walled elevators, each individual shop its own bright little self-contained world, complete with its own smell and its own sound spilling out into the shared open concourse. The food court is its own entire sensory empire. A wide ring of counters selling every conceivable kind of grease and sugar imaginable. The whole air thick with the mingled perfume of fried everything all at once. You carry a loaded tray of it over to a shared table under a skylight and eat there, surrounded by the full cross-section of suburban life. Families out for the afternoon, elderly walkers steadily doing their laps around the upper level, and knots of teenagers holding court near the food court railing. Because for the teenagers of this neighborhood especially, the mall is something close to genuinely sacred ground. It's the place you go simply to be somewhere, with no money in your pocket and no particular plan for the afternoon. To walk the loop endlessly, to see and to be seen. It's where you meet up with friends, where you circle the arcade with its glowing cabinets and its constant chorus of electronic bleeps and boops, where first dates happen quietly over a shared plate of fries, and where an entire adolescent social hierarchy gets negotiated in the open space just outside the record store. Which particular shopping bag you happen to be carrying says something real about who you are. And notably, everyone around you is reading everyone else's bags with real attention. The whole place hums with a genuine sense of permanence and importance, a settled feeling that this gleaming, enclosed little world is the actual center of everything, and always will be. It reads, in effect, as the old town square entirely reinvented for the age of the automobile. The place the whole community genuinely gathers, brighter and cleaner and more abundant than any old main street it quietly replaced. Standing up on the second level, looking down at the fountain and the crowds drifting below, it honestly feels like you're looking directly at the shape of the future. And there's a quiet, strange poignancy in that now, knowing what we happen to know, that so many of these gleaming cathedrals would eventually go silent, their fountains drained dry, their storefronts papered over from the inside, their vast parking lots slowly cracking apart in the sun. But nobody standing on that upper level tonight could possibly have imagined any of that. In this exact moment, the mall feels eternal and thrilling and completely full, a genuine monument to a decade that had quietly decided shopping itself was a form of belonging. So you ride the escalator upward into the bright, endless afternoon, credit card tucked away in a parent's pocket, ready to worship properly at the temple of more. And when the shopping finally winds down and everyone drives home tired and happy, dinner will already be waiting for you. And dinner, as it happens, has recently undergone a small revolution entirely of its own. One that arrives these days, frozen solid inside a compartmentalized tray. Chapter 13. Dinner arrives frozen and faintly menacing. Let's talk about dinner, which tonight arrives frozen solid and just a little bit menacing. The television dinner comes packaged inside a compartmentalized aluminum tray, each small square holding something beige, something orange, and a dessert that somehow manages to achieve a final temperature best described as either lava or solid ice, never, through any known method, both correctly at once. There's a genuine new marvel sitting on the kitchen counter too. The microwave oven, regarded by the whole household with roughly equal parts wonder and outright suspicion, as neighbors up and down the street quietly swap rumors about the invisible rays involved, and whether or not those rays might slowly cook you right alongside the peas. You peel back the foil lid, give the mystery inside a doubtful stir, and eat the whole thing sitting in front of the television set. Convenience was the entire promise of this decade, and it delivered on that promise one salty, radiated, faintly plastic-scented tray at a time. Nobody here reads the ingredient list. Nobody really dares to. The tray itself really is a small marvel of engineering, a molded vessel carefully divided into neat separate compartments so that no single food item ever has to touch another, a principle a great many children of this era considered to be, genuinely, the very height of civilized dining. In one square sits a slab of meat, drowning in a gravy roughly the color of a paper grocery bag. In another, a scoop of mashed potato. In a third, a scattering of peas or corn, or that oddly specific medley of diced mixed vegetables that seems to exist only inside frozen dinners and nowhere at all in the actual growing world. And in the smallest square of all, tucked into its own corner, the dessert, a hot fruit cobbler, or perhaps a small brownie, positioned there for maximum thermal betrayal. The great unsolved challenge of the television dinner in these early years was heat distribution, a problem it never quite managed to fully solve. Cook it long enough for the meat at the very center to properly thaw, and the potato out at the edges turns into a crust you could reasonably roll a shoe with. The dessert, sealed away in its own separate corner, either stays frozen rock solid straight through the middle, or achieves something close to molten rock temperature, and, on certain memorable occasions, manages to achieve both extremes within the very same bite. Eating one of these properly was a genuine lesson in managing your own expectations, testing every single bite cautiously with a fork before fully committing to it. But the real revolution sitting quietly on the kitchen counter is the microwave oven itself, and it's regarded with a wonder that borders, honestly, on the supernatural. Here is a box that cooks food entirely from the inside out, in a matter of minutes, without any visible flame or any obvious source of heat, through some genuinely invisible force that nobody in the household can properly explain. It feels less like an ordinary kitchen appliance, and more like a small captive miracle, and the whole family gathers around it the first few times just to watch through the little viewing window as a potato bakes itself in roughly the time it takes to finish a coffee break. Along with the wonder comes a suspicion that runs thick and persistent through the neighborhood. Rumors travel from house to house about the rays, those mysterious, invisible rays, and precisely what they might actually be doing while nobody's looking. People stand well back from the running machine, as if it might somehow leak. They trade warnings about standing too close to it while it operates, about whether it might slowly cook a person the very same way it cooks the peas inside, about vague, entirely unspecified dangers that nobody can quite put into precise words, yet everyone half believes anyway. The microwave gets welcomed warmly into the home, and simultaneously kept at a careful arm's length, a trusted household marvel that might, just possibly, also be quietly plotting something. The whole point of all of it, the compartmentalized trays, the humming box on the counter, the invisible rays, comes down to convenience, the grand organizing promise running underneath this entire decade. Both parents are increasingly out working full jobs. Time at home is genuinely short. The older model of one person spending a whole afternoon lovingly preparing an evening meal completely from scratch is quietly collapsing under its own weight. And into exactly that gap pours the frozen, the instant, the just add water, the peel back the film and heat. Dinner shifts, almost overnight, from an hour of real labor into a few minutes of simple unwrapping, and that shift gets sold, quite correctly in its own way, as a genuine kind of liberation. What gets quietly traded away in that particular bargain is a bit harder to see clearly. Nobody's reading the long ingredient list printed on the side of the box, all those preservatives, and the sodium and the additives carrying names with the syllable count of a small law firm. The food itself is engineered specifically for shelf life and speed of preparation, not really for nourishment, and the sheer salt content alone would raise more than a few eyebrows in any later decade. But it's easy and it feels genuinely modern, and modern in this decade is simply good. So the harder questions go entirely unasked. So you peel back the filmy foil lid, releasing a small puff of steam and a smell best described as vaguely institutional. Give the peas one last doubtful stir, and carry the whole tray into the living room to eat it there in the flickering blue glow of the television set. Because eating in front of the set is really the other essential half of the whole arrangement. And speaking of that glow, once the dishes, such as they are tonight, hit the trash can, plenty of people in this neighborhood head right back outside to pursue a very different fixation entirely. One involving direct sunlight and a genuinely alarming quantity of baby oil. Chapter 14, Worshipping the Sun. Let's step out to the backyard to work on a tan, because in this decade, a deep bronze glow stands as the single most desirable physical trait a human being could possibly possess. You slather yourself, not in sunscreen, but in plain baby oil, actively basting like a holiday roast, and stretch out flat in direct sunlight with a reflective full-covered board angled carefully up at your face for a little extra crisping around the jawline. New tanning salons are opening up all over town too, offering the exact same experience indoors now, on a low-humming bed lined with ultraviolet tubes. Pale skin in this world reads as something reserved for the sickly or the poor. A deep tan means leisure, means health, means success, and people chase it with a devotion that borders on the genuinely religious. The consequences of all this sit safely decades away and are, for now, remarkably easy to ignore. So you bake there, gleaming and golden, and call the whole thing looking healthy. The tan functions as much as a status symbol as anything else in this decade, and tracing the underlying logic of it tells you a great deal about the whole era. A deep bronze glow announces, without a word needing to be spoken, that you have real leisure time on your hands, that you've spent hours doing nothing at all but lying in the sun, that you can afford a vacation somewhere warm, or, at bare minimum, an entire idle afternoon with nowhere else to be. It signals health, vitality, and quiet prosperity all at once. Pale skin, which once marked out an aristocrat who never had to labor outdoors under the sun, has flipped its meaning entirely by this point, and now suggests illness, or poverty, or a sad little life spent shut indoors. So everyone out here chases that particular color with real, sustained intent. And the method, dear listener, is the genuinely alarming part. Sunscreen does exist by this point, but its job, as most people understand it at the time, is simply to let you stay out in the sun longer, not to actually keep the sun's rays off your skin. The real stated goal is maximum possible exposure, full stop. And toward that goal, people reach not for any kind of protection, but for plain baby oil, slathering it on thick and shiny, so the skin cooks faster underneath and browns that much deeper. You lie out there gleaming and greased, turning over at regular intervals like a piece of meat slowly rotating on a spit, working carefully toward an even, uniform finish. The comparison to roasting, notably, is not some joke being invented here for effect. It is, functionally, almost exactly the same process. For the truly committed sunbather, there's the reflector, a folding board covered in shiny foil, angled carefully up under the chin to bounce a bit of extra sunlight directly onto the face and throat, the two areas that always seem to tan slowest of all. Picture it properly. A person lying flat on their stomach in the backyard, oiled to a genuine shine, holding up a small mirror specifically to double the sun's assault on their own face, entirely on purpose, all in pursuit of a particular idea of beauty. It carries the flavor of a real ritual, and in a sense, it genuinely is one, a devotional practice with the sun itself standing in as the presiding deity. When the weather eventually turns colder, this whole devotion simply moves indoors, because the tanning salon has arrived on the scene by now. This is a genuine novelty, an entire business built around lying inside a low, humming coffin lined with ultraviolet tubes, acquiring that coveted bronze color entirely on demand, in any season, regardless of whatever the actual sky is doing outside that day. You book your session, climb into the glowing bed, pull the lid down over yourself, and bake steadily under artificial light engineered to do, in concentrated form, exactly what the ordinary sun does casually over the course of a whole afternoon. It's marketed as the modern, convenient, year-round path to looking properly healthy, and people sign up for it in genuine droves. The tan, in short, gets pursued with a single-mindedness that tips over, at points, into something close to genuinely religious devotion. An entire culture kneeling before the sun and its various indoor imitators, and any gentle suggestion that all of it might carry some kind of long-term cost gets brushed cheerfully aside, or more often, simply never raised in the first place. The information connecting all this eager basting to serious long-term harm is still slowly gathering at this point, still years away from arriving in real force at the average backyard patio. And so the whole enterprise runs along on a kind of blissful deferral. The reward, that gorgeous golden glow, arrives immediately and stays fully visible, admired openly by everyone around you. The bill for it won't come due for decades yet, and a bill that far off barely registers as a bill at all to a person lying happily and warm in the grass on a Sunday afternoon. It's a genuinely heavier subject tucked quietly inside a lighter one, so I'll set it down gently here, and simply say that a great many perfectly sensible people spent a great many sunny afternoons doing themselves a slow, quiet kind of harm that they had every reasonable cause, at the time, to believe was actually good for them. So you stretch back out on the towel, the oil gleaming, the reflector angled just so, and give yourself entirely over to the sun with the contented sigh of somebody doing something wholesome and good for their health. And when at last you rise, pink and glowing and thoroughly pleased with yourself, and wander back inside the house, there's a small cabinet in the upstairs bathroom holding a very different, much quieter method this era relied on for simply getting through the day. Chapter 15. Behind the bathroom mirror. Open up the bathroom cabinet now, and let's be gentle here, because tucked behind that mirror sits the quiet coping mechanism of an entire generation. Prescription tranquilizers get handed out freely in this decade, especially to overwhelmed homemakers, so commonly in fact that they earn a grim little nickname of their own, the small helper that gets you through the day. Doctors prescribe them readily for nerves, for restlessness, for the ordinary crushing weight of a life that looks entirely perfect from the outside, and quite often does not feel that way from within. Nobody talks much, at this point, about the risk of dependency. The pill simply smooths the rough edges down, keeps the smile fixed firmly in place, keeps the whole household running smoothly on schedule. Beneath the cheerful, tidy surface of suburban calm, a great many people are simply being medicated into fitting that surface, one small amber bottle at a time, and almost entirely in silence. Let's set this particular scene without any wink or irony at all, because this one genuinely calls for a steady hand. Picture the woman of the house here, the one this entire era quietly assigned an enormous, largely invisible job to. She keeps the home spotless. She raises the children. She cooks every meal. She manages the whole family's schedule down to the last appointment. She presents a perfectly composed face to the neighbors on the street. And she does every bit of this while being told, gently and constantly, that this arrangement is fulfillment itself, that she ought to feel content, because a nice house and a healthy family are supposedly everything a person could reasonably want out of life. And if, underneath all of that, she happens to feel a real restlessness, a real anxiety, a quiet and largely unnamed unhappiness, the surrounding culture has very little actual language ready for that feeling, and even less patience for hearing it spoken aloud. So that feeling goes to the family doctor, because where else, realistically, would it go? And the doctor, meaning entirely well within the understanding of the time, reaches for the prescription pad. The pills themselves are mild tranquilizers, sedatives meant broadly to calm the nerves, and they get dispensed widely and quite casually, especially to homemakers, for complaints as vague as simply feeling tense, or being unable to properly relax, or not coping quite the way one feels one really ought to be coping. They become so common sitting in the medicine cabinets of suburban mothers across the country that they pick up a whole shared cultural shorthand of their own, a quiet, knowing nickname for the little helper that gets a person through a long afternoon. And in the narrow sense, they genuinely work. They smooth things over. They take the sharpest edge off the anxiety and let a person keep functioning, keep making it through the long, shapeless day. They keep the smile fixed in place. They keep the whole household humming along right on schedule. And from the outside, Often from the inside, too, it genuinely looks like it's helping, because the visible problem, the tension, the fraying at the edges, does temporarily ease. The machine of daily life keeps running. The image holds together. What goes almost entirely undiscussed here is the question of dependency. The basic understanding of how these particular medications could quietly hook a person, how the body itself could come to genuinely need them, how difficult stopping could eventually become, all of that remains thin and rarely spoken about out loud in any real depth. A person can drift, quite easily, into a genuine dependence one refill at a time, while everyone around her, including her own doctor, regards the whole thing as simple, ongoing treatment for a case of nerves. There's no real framework in place yet for calling any of it a problem, and so for a great many women, it never really gets called anything at all. Sitting underneath all of this is a real sadness, and it's worth naming plainly. A great many people, women especially, are being medicated in this decade not because anything is genuinely wrong with them, but because the shape of the life they've been handed simply doesn't fit right. And rather than question that shape directly, the surrounding culture finds it far easier to quietly sedate the discomfort instead. The pill treats the symptom and leaves the actual underlying cause completely untouched. And that cause, the isolation, the constant pressure, the narrow, tightly defined role, stays exactly where it was all along. None of this, in the main, involves any real villains. The doctors genuinely believe they're helping. The families genuinely believe things are fine. The women themselves often believe, quietly, that the real problem must be some kind of personal weakness on their part, some failure to feel as happy as the life they've been given supposedly warrants. Everyone here is doing their honest best inside a set of assumptions that simply has a hole in it somewhere. And the pills fill that hole quietly enough that the underlying assumptions never really have to get examined at all. So the small amber bottle sits there behind the mirror, unremarkable, entirely respectable, properly prescribed, quietly holding an entire generation's unspoken strain inside it. And the house goes right on gleaming, and the smiles go right on holding steady, and hardly anyone ever says a single word about any of it, and smoothing over discomfort turns out to be very much the spirit of this whole age, extending even out into the air itself, which people are busy filling, at this very moment, with a fine chemical mist, for reasons that feel, at the time, entirely sensible. Chapter 16. The Spray Can and the Hole in the Sky. Let's talk about the spray can, because in this decade, if a product could be pressurized into a can, somebody had already gone ahead and done it. Hairspray holds towering hairstyles rigid against any wind and against basic reason, applied in clouds thick enough to fog up the entire bathroom mirror. There's spray deodorant. There's spray cheese. There's spray furniture polish, spray on tan, spray absolutely everything you can think of. The propellant of choice in nearly all of it is a chemical compound quietly drifting upward, working away at a growing hole in the ozone layer, the planet's own built-in sunscreen. Word of this is only just beginning to spread, arriving as a faintly alarming rumor sandwiched somewhere between the weather report and the evening sports scores. You don't feel any of the damage happening. You just hear the satisfying hiss, admire your perfectly immovable hair in the mirror, and reach for the can again tomorrow morning. The hair alone practically justifies an entire industry on its own. This is an age of genuinely ambitious hairstyles, volume, height, elaborate architectural teasing, and none of it would survive 5 minutes in a light breeze without some serious chemical intervention. So the hairspray gets applied not as a modest little spritz, but as a sustained, enveloping cloud, a fog you lean straight into with your eyes shut and your breath held, emerging afterward with a coiffure so rigid it could genuinely turn away rain, wind, and the occasional small, confused bird. The bathroom afterward hangs thick with the mist for a good while, a fine lacquer settling gently onto the mirror, the counter, the towels, absolutely everything in the room. But hairspray is really only the flagship product here. The genuine enthusiasm running through this whole era is for the aerosol principle itself, the sheer, uncomplicated delight of pressing a single button and having a product leap out as a fine, even mist. If a thing could conceivably be dispensed from a pressurized can, somebody somewhere had already put it in one. Deodorant sprays on in one cold, satisfying blast. Furniture polish gets sprayed on and wiped away. Air freshener whooshes into every room of the house at the press of a button. There's cooking spray, spray-on sunscreen, spray-on bandage, even a genuine dairy product, cheese, propelled out of a can in a soft orange rope, regarded by more or less every child of the era as one of civilization's genuinely finest achievements. The convenience of it all feels like the future arriving early, and in fairness, it really is genuinely handy. No pumping required, no messy smearing, just one clean, even coat of whatever you happen to need, delivered instantly with a deeply satisfying hiss. The aerosol can is modernity itself, small enough to hold comfortably in one hand, and the average household bristles with them. A whole fleet of pressurized cylinders lined up neatly in every cabinet, ready to mist forth at the slightest press of a finger. The trouble, and here's where we have to turn our attention upward toward the sky, is the propellant, that invisible gas quietly pushing all that product out of all those cans. It belongs to a class of chemical that, once released into the air, drifts slowly and steadily upward, past the weather systems entirely, all the way up to a thin, high layer of the atmosphere that quietly shields the whole planet from the harsher end of the sun's light. And up there, these particular chemicals set about slowly breaking that shield down, gnawing patiently away at it, opening up a growing thinness in the planet's own built-in sunscreen. Word of all this begins filtering down to the average household bathroom as the decade wears on, and it arrives in a strange, half-formed sort of way. A piece of genuinely unsettling news tucked in between the weather forecast and the evening sports scores. A rumor about a hole opening up somewhere in the sky. It sounds, honestly, almost too large and too abstract to be entirely real. This idea that the small can of hairspray sitting in your hand right now is connected somehow to an actual wound torn into the atmosphere far overhead. There's real concern and real confusion, and a slow, dawning unease, and eventually, genuinely, real coordinated action, as much of the world comes together to phase the worst offending chemicals out entirely. One of this whole decade's real, quiet triumphs. But that particular resolution arrives later. In the thick of things right now, the disconnect is total. You cannot feel the damage happening. You cannot see the actual hole. What you can see, clearly, is your hair holding its shape flawlessly through a stiff wind. What you can feel is the pleasant, immediate efficiency of the spray. And what you can hear is that satisfying hiss. And against those immediate, tangible certainties, some invisible injury happening to a layer of sky you've never once thought to look up at simply cannot compete for your attention. So you reach for the can again, and then again after that, misting your hair and your underarms and your furniture and even your dinner, entirely untroubled by any of it, while high up above the tidy rooftops of this whole neighborhood, the atmosphere quietly keeps its own running tally of every single hiss. And smoothing your outward appearance turns out to be only one front in a much larger campaign this decade is waging, one fought hardest of all against the human body itself. Chapter 17, The War Against the Body. Let's talk now about the war on the human body, waged largely in kitchens and bathrooms up and down this street. Fad diets sweep through the neighborhood like passing weather systems, each one promising a small miracle and mostly delivering plain hunger instead. There's the cabbage soup diet. There's the grapefruit diet. There's the powdered shake standing in for actual meals. Artificial sweeteners arrive on the scene too, bringing with them a fresh swirl of low-grade panic about what exactly they might secretly be doing to you. Aerobics videos play on a loop in living rooms across the neighborhood, people bouncing along in neon leotards towards some promised form of salvation. And the bathroom scale rules over the household's daily mood like a small, cruel little judge sitting in the corner. It's a genuinely heavy subject, dressed up here in cheerful spandex. So I'll simply say this much plainly. An entire culture is being quietly taught to consider itself at war with its own body, and told, cheerfully the whole time, that the war itself was supposed to be fun. Because this particular chapter touches on something that can genuinely hurt people even now, I'll keep the tone here steady and even, and skip past the specific details, simply describing the strange overall landscape of it instead. The fad diet stands as this era's great false hope, and it arrives in successive waves, each one sweeping through the neighborhood with the total confidence of settled fact, before quietly receding to make room for whatever comes next. There's one built entirely around eating enormous quantities of a particular soup. There's one organized around a single piece of fruit. There's the powdered meal replacement, a canister of flavored dust you mix into water and drink in place of an actual meal, marketed as the sensible, modern path toward a smaller self. None of them really work, not in any lasting way, which is precisely why there's always a brand new one arriving right on schedule to take the last one's place. The pattern repeats itself as reliably as the changing seasons. A diet sweeps in, promising real ease and real transformation, delivers a few weeks of genuine hunger and one brief, temporary result, and then quietly fails. And the failure, notably, never gets blamed on the diet itself. It always somehow gets blamed on the person who tried it. Into this whole landscape arrive the artificial sweeteners, a chemistry-set answer to the entire problem. Sweetness without any of the caloric consequence, and they get embraced instantly, everywhere at once. They go into the soft drinks, into the coffee, into the little paper packets sitting on every single restaurant table in the country. And around them swirls a persistent, low-grade panic, a steady stream of rumor and quiet worry about what exactly these laboratory-made sweetnesses might secretly be doing inside a person's body. A running argument that flares up periodically and dies back down again, and never quite gets fully resolved, so that people go on sweetening their morning coffee and quietly worrying about it in more or less the same motion. The exercise side of this whole campaign is, at least, a fair bit more energetic and considerably more visible. The aerobics craze fills living rooms across the country with people following along to rented videotapes, bouncing and stretching and reaching in careful coordinated unison, dressed in this era's genuinely astonishing uniform of neon leotards, sweatbands, and leg warmers. There's a real, uncomplicated joy in a good deal of it, a genuine communal cheerfulness, whole groups of neighbors sweating along together to the exact same peppy instructor on the screen. It stands, honestly, as the most wholesome front of this whole war, movement pursued simply for its own sake, and it deserves real credit for that. But presiding over all of it, in bathroom after bathroom up and down the street, sits the true tyrant of this entire age, the bathroom scale. That small, flat device sitting on the tile floor holds a genuinely startling amount of power over the household's overall mood. The single number it produces each morning can set the emotional weather for an entire day ahead. It can dictate what a person eats, how they feel about themselves, and whether they walk out the front door feeling confident or quietly defeated. It gets consulted like a small oracle and obeyed like a judge handing down a verdict. And it gives absolutely nothing back in return except a cold, context-free number. What this whole cheerful, spandex-clad enterprise really adds up to is a culture quietly teaching itself, and its own children right alongside it, to regard the human body as a kind of adversary, a thing to be constantly monitored and disciplined, and never quite fully trusted, a project that is always somehow failing and always in need of just a little more work. The message arrives dressed up in upbeat music and bright, cheerful colors and a tone of pure empowerment. And underneath all of that runs something considerably less kind. I'll leave this particular chapter here, gently, because this is genuinely one of those areas where a light touch is the respectful one. And simply note that a great many people spent this whole decade quietly at war with themselves, believing, the entire time, that the war itself was really just a hobby. And if the body was one steady source of low, humming background anxiety, it had serious competition from a much larger dread altogether, one that hung over the entire neighborhood at once and didn't fit neatly into any single bathroom cabinet at all. Chapter 18. The low hum of dread beneath the sprinklers. Let's talk now about the low background hum of dread, the one nobody in this neighborhood ever quite manages to escape. Somewhere out there in the world, missiles exist, pointed and ready, and everybody here knows it perfectly well. Television airs a film so genuinely bleak, depicting a nuclear war unfolding in an ordinary American town, that families across the whole country watch it together in their living rooms and then sit afterward in stunned, heavy silence. Children lying awake in the quiet before sleep genuinely wonder whether the world will still be there in the morning when they wake up. The suburbs on the surface look like the single safest place on the entire planet, nothing but lawns and porch lights and locked front doors. And yet this very same suburb stars, again and again, in everyone's private mental image of how the whole thing might end. You mow the grass beneath a sky that might, at least in theory, open up at any given moment. That particular tension lives quietly underneath everything, patient and entirely unspoken, humming away beneath the steady rhythm of the sprinklers. The dread itself is strange precisely because it's so total and so quiet at exactly the same time. There's no siren wailing daily through the streets, no visible threat marching openly down the block. There are simply missiles somewhere far off, pointed generally in your direction, and an equal number pointed back the other way in return, and every single person on Earth living quietly inside that whole arrangement, going about their ordinary daily business right underneath it. It stands as the single largest fact in the entire world, and also, on most ordinary days, entirely invisible, which is a genuinely strange thing for the human mind to hold onto at once. Children absorb this particular weight in their own particular way. They process it the way children generally process anything too large to fully grasp, soaking up the surrounding grown-up anxiety without any of the grown-up context to go along with it, and turning it over privately in the dark once the lights go out. Plenty of kids from this era lie awake at night with a genuine, entirely unanswerable question of whether the world will simply still be there when they wake up the next morning, whether the whole thing might quietly end in a single flash some perfectly ordinary night while everyone in the house is fast asleep. It's a genuinely heavy thing to hand a child, even without meaning to, and this era hands it out fairly freely in the background, without ever quite intending to. And then television goes and makes the whole thing vivid. A film gets broadcast directly into living rooms right across the entire country, dramatizing a nuclear attack landing on a plain, entirely ordinary American town, the exact kind of town everybody watching happens to live in themselves, full of people who look and sound just like them. It doesn't soften a single detail. It shows the flash and the long aftermath in genuinely unflinching detail, and an enormous national audience watches all of it together on one single night. And when it finally ends, families across the country sit together in their own living rooms in a stunned, heavy silence, having just watched their own neighborhood stand in for the actual end of the world. That turns out to be the specific, particular cruelty of the suburban version of this whole dread. The suburbs were sold, from the very start, as the single safest possible place imaginable. That was the entire point of them, the retreat from every danger the wider world had to offer, all porch lights and locked doors and quiet, empty streets. And yet the suburb also happens to be exactly the setting everyone instinctively pictures for the actual catastrophe, the ordinary backdrop against which the truly unthinkable always gets imagined. The safest possible place and the imagined site of the very end turn out to be the same place, and everyone here happens to be living inside it at once. So the tension threads itself quietly through absolutely everything, not as some constant scream, but as a low, steady hum running just beneath the surface of ordinary daily life. You mow the lawn and the missiles still exist. You grill dinner out back, and the missiles still exist. You watch the sprinkler arc steadily back and forth across the grass in the warm, golden evening light, and somewhere far over the horizon, the whole terrible apparatus sits there, quietly waiting. And both things, somehow, are simply true at the very same time: the sprinkler and the missiles, the peace and the shadow sitting patiently behind it. People cope, mostly, by simply not talking about any of it directly, which turns out to be this whole era's general approach to most genuinely heavy things. The dread gets folded quietly into the background and left there, acknowledged only occasionally in a dark joke, or a school drill, or an uneasy silence settling in after that particular film, but rarely brought out into the open and examined directly. It's simply too large a thing to look at head-on for very long, so people look instead at their lawns, and their cars, and the small, perfectly manageable competitions playing out across the neighborhood, and let the much larger thing hum quietly away underneath it all. And so life goes on, beautifully and anxiously at once, the porch lights glowing warmly, the grass immaculate, the whole tidy dream sitting quietly underneath a sky that everyone here on some level quietly understands might not actually hold. It's a strange weight to carry through such genuinely pleasant surroundings, and people carry it anyway, mostly in silence, mostly while pushing a mower steadily across the lawn. And that same particular talent, for absorbing an enormous fear and quietly channeling it somewhere small and manageable, shows up again in one of this decade's genuinely strange and unsettling episodes, when a very different kind of panic swept through these exact same tidy streets. Chapter 19: The Face on the Milk Carton. Pour yourself a glass of milk at breakfast, and you might just come face to face with a missing child, because their photograph sits printed right there on the side of the carton. This is the age of a swelling national fear about children being taken, a panic that reaches directly into every home on the street and quietly reshapes childhood itself. Suddenly, the free, unsupervised roaming of just a few years earlier arrives wrapped in a whole new layer of warnings. Kids get carefully drilled on strangers, on suspicious vans slowing down at the curb, on saying no loudly and simply running. Some of this fear is genuinely grounded in real events. A great deal of it gets amplified far beyond the actual statistical risk, sold nightly by a news cycle that has quietly discovered fear is a remarkably reliable thing to sell. It's a genuinely tender subject, so let's simply note plainly that a whole generation grew up glancing carefully over its shoulder, and the milk carton became a small, quiet daily reminder of exactly that. The milk carton itself is the image that lingers longest, and it's worth pausing on gently here. There, right on the side of the ordinary carton sitting on every breakfast table beside the cereal box and the toast rack, sits the face of a missing child, a photograph, a name, a date, looking directly out at the family gathered around their morning meal. It's a genuinely well-meant effort, a real and sincere attempt to bring lost children home by putting their faces in front of millions of eyes each morning. And it does work on occasion. But it also means that every single morning, a child sitting down to breakfast meets the face of another child who has simply vanished, and quietly absorbs, without a single word being spoken, the lesson that vanishing itself is entirely possible. That particular lesson lands on a whole generation and reshapes the entire texture of childhood as a result. The kids of just a few years earlier had roamed more or less freely out the front door after breakfast and back again by dinner time, ranging across neighborhoods and vacant lots and patches of woods with a liberty that would, quite soon, come to seem almost entirely unimaginable. Now that same freedom arrives wrapped in a steadily thickening layer of warning, hemmed in by rules and fears that hadn't quite existed in the same form before. The instruction is constant and specific. Children get drilled, both at school and at home, in the full doctrine of stranger danger. Don't talk to people you don't already know. Don't accept anything at all from them, not candy, not an invitation to see a puppy, not a plea for help finding a lost pet. Watch carefully for the car that slows down near you. Know exactly how to say no loudly, how to run, how to make a genuine scene if you need to. A whole small curriculum of wariness gets installed carefully in young children, delivered with the very best of intentions and the sharpest possible anxiety, and they carry all of it out with them into every walk to school and every afternoon spent at the park. Now, the honest accounting here has to be handled delicately, and it genuinely deserves care in both directions at once. There were real dangers in this decade, and real tragedies, and real families whose very worst nightmares genuinely came true. And nothing about the broader cultural panic should ever be allowed to erase the real weight of that. At the very same time, the fear that swept through the culture at large grew far larger than the actual statistical frequency of the danger ever really warranted, inflating into something that quietly reshaped millions of individual childhoods over a risk that, in cold statistical terms, remained genuinely rare. Part of what drove that inflation was a news cycle that had discovered a durable, reliable truth about human attention, that fear holds it like almost nothing else can. A frightened viewer keeps right on watching. A worried parent tunes back in for the next update. And so the coverage leans in hard, night after night, on the most alarming stories available, presenting genuinely rare horrors with a frequency and intensity that makes them feel, quite falsely, like something common, feeding a broader sense of siege that runs well ahead of the actual underlying facts. The end result is a whole generation growing up with a particular, distinctive over-the-shoulder wariness stitched permanently into it. A baseline sense that the world just beyond the front door is populated with a kind of quiet, waiting menace, that danger itself wears an entirely ordinary face and drives an entirely ordinary car. Some of that caution, to be fair, was genuinely sensible and protective. Some of it was a heavy and largely unnecessary weight to lay across a child who was, in all likelihood, perfectly safe walking the 3 blocks to school that morning. So I'll leave this particular chapter exactly where it belongs, treated plainly and without any wink at all, because it involves real children and real grief, and there's genuinely nothing here to be light about. A whole generation ate its breakfast each morning beside the faces of the lost, learned carefully to watch for the slowing car, and carried a low, careful vigilance forward with it into a world that was mostly, quietly, going to turn out fine after all. Chapter 20, The Strangest Panic of All. Now for one of the genuinely strangest chapters in this whole story, and one we need to tread through with real care. A wave of fear sweeps across the entire country in this decade, gripped by the conviction that some kind of hidden evil is lurking quietly inside perfectly ordinary things. A tabletop fantasy game played with dice gets blamed for corrupting the young. Rock records get played backward on turntables in living rooms, in earnest searches for secret hidden messages. Ordinary daycare workers find themselves accused, on genuinely flimsy grounds, of unspeakable acts, and real families and real reputations get destroyed in the frenzy that follows. This is mass panic, breaking out inside a nation that considers itself entirely modern and rational, solid proof that fear, once it gets loose, tends to follow a logic entirely of its own. There's genuine, lasting harm buried inside this particular story, so we'll walk through it plainly, without a single wink, because the people caught up in it deserved far better than the hysteria they actually got. The basic shape of it runs like this. A conviction takes hold, spreading steadily through churches, through daytime talk shows, through worried living rooms across the country, that some kind of hidden network of evil is operating in plain sight, quietly woven into the ordinary objects and pastimes of everyday American life. The threat gets described as being everywhere at once and simultaneously invisible, which happens to be the most powerful kind of threat there is, because it can never actually be disproven, and it can always, conveniently, be found in one more place nobody had thought to look yet. The tabletop fantasy game becomes an early and particularly visible target, a game played with dice, and imagination, and pencil and paper, in which a group of players simply pretend to be heroes exploring invented fictional worlds together. To the people caught up in the growing panic, this looks unmistakably like a doorway leading somewhere dark, a corrupting influence quietly luring young people toward the occult. Parents grow genuinely alarmed. The game itself, which is in cold reality just a group of teenagers sitting around a kitchen table describing imaginary dungeons to one another, gets recast almost overnight as something genuinely sinister, and the kids who play it regularly find themselves regarded with real, uncomfortable suspicion by neighbors and even by their own extended family. Then come the records, and the growing belief that popular music carries secret evil messages hidden somewhere inside it, audible only when the songs get played in careful reverse. People sit for hours with their turntables spinning albums backward, straining hard to hear the buried commands they've become convinced were deliberately planted there to corrupt the unsuspecting listener. Exactly how a message played backward could somehow influence a mind that only ever hears the song playing forward never gets particularly well explained. But explanation, in this particular moment, is rather beside the point. The fear supplies its own evidence, hearing precisely what it already expected to hear inside the garbled, reversed static. These particular strands of the panic, the game and the records, are, for the most part, fairly absurd, the kind of thing a later, calmer decade can look back on and simply shake its head at with a rueful smile. But the panic doesn't stop there, doesn't stay confined to the realm of the merely silly. And this is exactly the point where the tone here has to steady itself, because it goes on to do real and lasting damage to real people. The fear finds its way into daycare centers, and there, it destroys lives. Ordinary child care workers, people who have done nothing at all except look after other people's young children, find themselves accused of monstrous crimes on the basis of evidence that would not withstand a single moment of sober, careful scrutiny. Investigations get built on flawed questioning techniques that end up gently coaxing small children into confirming things that had genuinely never happened at all. Accusations multiply, growing steadily wilder and more physically impossible with each retelling, until the charges eventually describe events that simply could not have occurred in the real world. And yet the whole machinery grinds relentlessly forward anyway, because once the fear is fully loose, any expressed doubt about it starts to look, to the frightened crowd, like a kind of complicity. The real cost here gets borne entirely by the accused, who lose their reputations, their livelihoods, their freedom, and years of their actual lives to allegations that, in case after case, simply were never true. Families get shattered in the process. Innocent people end up branded with some of the worst labels a society can possibly apply to a person. And by the time the whole frenzy finally cools down, and a cooler, more careful examination manages to pull the individual cases apart, the damage has long since been done, and it cannot be taken back. This is the part of the story that gets no jokes attached to it at all, because there is genuinely nothing in it worth laughing at. What the whole episode reveals is deeply uncomfortable, namely, just how thin the floor of rationality can actually turn out to be. Even inside a society that prides itself openly on being modern and reasonable, fear, given the right set of conditions, can spread considerably faster than the plain facts ever could, and can convince perfectly decent, intelligent, well-meaning people to see monsters hiding in their own neighbors, and to do genuine, lasting harm in the name of protecting their own children. It's worth remembering plainly, without any wink at all, because the real lesson buried in it isn't really about that one decade specifically. So we'll set this particular chapter down carefully, with real respect for the people it hurt, and move on now to something that also came knocking at the suburban front door in this decade, though this particular visitor arrived wearing a warm smile and a friendly sales pitch rather than any kind of accusation. Chapter 21, The Living Room Sales Pitch. Let's talk about the knock at the door, or worse, The friendly invitation to a party that turns out, once you're actually inside, to be a full sales pitch. Your neighbor has discovered a genuine opportunity, and it's about to change their entire life, and they would love so much for you to get in on it early. Maybe it's plastic food storage containers. Maybe it's cleaning products or cosmetics or vitamins. Whatever the actual product happens to be, the real thing being sold here is always the dream itself, passed carefully from living room to living room in a shimmering chain, where the person sitting near the top profits steadily off the person sitting below them. Most people down at the bottom of that chain end up losing both money and friendships in roughly equal measure. But the pitch itself is warm, and it wears the face of somebody you already know and trust. And that, as it turns out, is exactly what makes the whole thing work. The invitation usually arrives dressed up as something entirely friendly: a card left in the mailbox, a phone call from a neighbor down the street, a warm suggestion to come over for a little get-together. Nothing formal at all, just a few friends catching up. You arrive expecting coffee and easy conversation, and instead find a living room rearranged with folding chairs, a small, careful display of products laid out on the dining table, and a host who has, over the past few weeks, become mysteriously and quite evangelically enthusiastic about a particular brand of something or other. And then the pitch begins, delivered by the very same neighbor you've known for years, now transformed entirely into a salesperson with a glossy binder and a genuine light in their eyes. This product changed their whole life, they explain, leaning in close. This opportunity is genuinely extraordinary. And the truly wonderful part, they add, is that you don't just get to buy the product yourself, you get to sell it too. You can build your own small business around it, and better yet, recruit other people to sell it right alongside you, earning a small piece of everything they sell, and everything the people they recruit go on to sell after that, all the way down the chain. The specific products vary from house to house, but the underlying structure never changes at all. Sometimes it's food storage containers, demonstrated with a genuine little flourish. Sometimes it's cosmetics, or cleaning supplies, or vitamins, or kitchen knives, or any one of a dozen other things. The actual item hardly matters in the end, because the item was never really what was being sold in the first place. What's actually being sold is the dream itself, the promise of independence and real wealth and freedom, the vision of a genuinely better life sitting just a few recruits away. And that particular dream stays exactly the same, regardless of whatever happens to be sitting on the dining table that evening. The underlying mechanics of the whole arrangement reward, above all, the people who got in early and near the very top of the chain, who get to sit back comfortably and collect a small share of the labor being done by everyone recruited beneath them. The higher up that chain you happen to sit, the better the whole system works for you, which means the shining stories of success circulating near the top are technically true, and also entirely unrepresentative of what's actually waiting for the person just now signing up at the bottom. Because down at the bottom, where the vast majority of people actually end up, the math turns quietly cruel. You buy a starter kit, an entire inventory of product you're now personally responsible for moving. You host your own living room parties in turn. You lean on your own friends and neighbors the way your neighbor leaned on you, and you mostly discover fairly quickly that the actual market for this particular product, among the people you personally know, is small and gets exhausted rather fast. The inventory quietly piles up in the garage. The promised recruits never quite materialize. And the money, exactly as the whole system was designed to do, keeps flowing steadily upward, away from you. What makes this genuinely painful, more than the lost money itself, is what the whole arrangement does to real relationships. Because the entire engine runs on trust, on the warmth of an existing friendship being gently, gradually turned into a sales channel. You lean on your friends to buy in and to join up, and they in turn lean on theirs, and underneath all the smiles, a real strain quietly creeps in. People grow wary of the neighbor who keeps inviting them to things. Friendships cool around the awkwardness of the constant ask. The social fabric of the whole street frays a little, one enthusiastic living room pitch at a time. And yet the whole thing keeps working anyway, spreading steadily from house to house, precisely because it wears such a friendly face. A cold stranger trying to sell you a dream is easy enough to turn down. A trusted neighbor, someone you genuinely like, sitting sincerely in their own living room, honestly believing they're offering you a gift, that's a considerably harder thing to say no to. The trust itself is the mechanism, and the trust is exactly what ends up getting spent. So you sit there in the folding chair, nod along politely, maybe buy a set of containers just to be polite about it, and quietly decline the life-changing opportunity being offered. And the whole shimmering enterprise simply moves on to the next living room a few houses down the street. And when the pitch finally wraps up and the guests have all gone home, the host might well retreat to the one room in the house specifically designed for exactly that kind of decompression. A room that deserves an entire chapter of its own. Chapter 22. The Kingdom in the Basement. Let's head down now to the basement, that subterranean little kingdom of leisure and quiet, patient rot. The walls down here are covered in faux wood paneling. The floor wears a shag carpet in a brown so deep it seems almost to absorb light itself, and possibly the odd small object too. There's a wet bar that nobody, strictly speaking, actually needed. A row of matching bar stools. A color television roughly the size of a small appliance. This is where the adults retreat to have a quiet drink, and where the kids retreat to escape the adults entirely. It feels cozy down here, private, faintly glamorous. It's also, quite often, damp, poorly ventilated, and steadily cultivating a healthy little colony of mold somewhere behind that cheerful paneling. The rec room is where Suburbia comes to relax, to exhale, and to slowly, softly breathe in whatever happens to be growing quietly in the dark. The descent down the stairs is really a descent into an entirely different climate. The basement runs a few degrees cooler than the rest of the house at all times, and it carries its own particular smell, a mix of old carpet and older furniture, with something faintly earthy sitting underneath it all. The smell, in short, of a space sitting below ground level, working hard to pass itself off as a proper room. You flip the switch at the top of the stairs, and the fluorescent tubes flicker slowly to life over a small world entirely its own. The paneling is really the defining feature of the whole space. Thin sheets of fake wood grain, nailed straight up over bare concrete and exposed studs, transforming a raw, damp cellar into something that reads, if you don't look too closely at it, as a cozy little den. It's cheap, it's easy to install, and it's absolutely everywhere. The default finishing material for basements right across the country. It gives the whole room a warm brown glow and a rustic cabin feeling, and it quietly hides a great deal behind its cheerfully printed surface. The floor down here is carpeted in shag too, and the basement shag is always, without exception, the boldest and darkest in the entire house. A deep, total brown that seems to genuinely drink the light around it. It's soft and thick and forgiving underfoot, wonderful to sprawl out on while watching television, and it also happens to be a genuine marvel of concealment, quietly swallowing dropped popcorn, small toys, loose change, and over the years, a slowly accumulating archive of practically everything the family has ever misplaced down there. The furnishings tell you exactly what this room is really for. There's, improbably, a full wet bar, a small counter complete with a sink, a mirror and neat rows of glassware, precisely the kind of feature a household installs to feel a certain way about itself, rather than out of any genuine need for a bar in the basement. There are tall stools lined up to go with it. There's the enormous color television, a genuine piece of furniture in its own right, housed inside a wooden cabinet roughly the size of a small car, standing as the glowing centerpiece around which the whole room gets arranged. And it serves two rather different populations who mostly keep entirely different hours. In the evening, it's the adults' retreat, the place they come to have a quiet drink, watch the big set, entertain their own friends away from the more formal living room upstairs. During the day, and especially on long weekends and rainy afternoons, it belongs entirely to the kids, the place they can sprawl out freely, play for hours, watch cartoons, and generally exist well out from under any direct adult supervision. Cozy, private, faintly glamorous, a room that genuinely feels like a bit of luxury, a whole extra floor devoted purely to leisure. The trouble, as with so much else in this tidy world, sits quietly underground and entirely out of sight. Basements sit below the level of the surrounding earth, and the earth, of course, is damp, and all that cheerful paneling and thick, soft carpet sits directly up against walls that quietly wick in moisture year-round. Ventilation is an afterthought at best, and so, behind the warm, printed wood grain, in the narrow dark space between the paneling and the bare concrete, conditions turn out to be more or less ideal for mold to settle in and flourish quietly. A hidden colony steadily spreading behind the coziest room in the whole house. Nobody down here can see it. Mostly, nobody even smells it beyond a faint, vague mustiness everyone stopped consciously noticing a good while back. And so the family gathers down here year after year, breathing in the air of a room that's slowly, patiently cultivating something inside its own walls. It's the exact same pattern running through the rest of the house, comfort sitting right on the surface, and a quiet problem humming away underneath it. Only here, it happens to sit literally beneath your own feet and directly behind your own back. So the whole household gathers in the warm glow of that giant television, sunk deep into the dark brown shag carpet, perfectly at ease in this cozy little underground kingdom, breathing in whatever the dark corners happen to be growing that year. And the adults, settling onto those bar stools as the evening winds down, reach with practiced, familiar ease for the exact ritual this whole room was really built around in the first place. Chapter 23: How the Grown-Ups Unwound. Let's talk about how the grown-ups in this neighborhood chose to unwind, which was, generously speaking, quite a lot. The cocktail stands as a genuine fixture of daily life here, poured at dinner parties, at backyard barbecues, and on perfectly ordinary Tuesday evenings, all with roughly equal enthusiasm. Drinking heavily reads as social, sophisticated, and largely unquestioned, simply part of being a grown adult who's earned the right to a drink at the end of a long day. The liquor cabinet stands as a genuine point of household pride. Neighbors gather under the patio lights to smoke and drink and laugh together late into the evening, and driving home afterward gets treated, as we've already noted, as its own small adventure in pure luck. Underneath all the fun runs a quieter current of dependence, carefully dressed up as simple hospitality, of a whole culture that has quietly made numbing yourself look exactly like celebrating. You raise your glass right along with everyone else, the ice clinking pleasantly in the warm evening air, and nobody at all is keeping count. The cocktail hour stands as a genuine institution here, complete with its own hardware, its own vocabulary, its own careful etiquette. There's the proper glassware, different shapes reserved for different drinks. There's the shaker, the various little tools, the ice bucket with its small matching tongs. There's a whole distinct culture built around the mixing itself, the well-made drink treated as a small performance of hospitality and personal taste. And the man of the house who mixes a genuinely good one for his guests takes real pride in the skill, and rightly so within the terms of the time. Drinking itself is woven directly through the fabric of ordinary daily life here, not reserved for special occasions alone, but present at most of them, and plenty of the entirely unspecial ones too. There's the drink poured the moment you get home from work, the standard end-of-day ritual, arriving almost the second the coat comes off. There's the wine or the highball served alongside dinner. There's the drink at the backyard barbecue, the drink at the dinner party, the drink at the neighborhood gathering, and there's, quite unremarkably, the drink poured on a plain midweek evening for no particular reason at all beyond it simply being evening. The liquor cabinet itself stands as a genuine point of household pride, well stocked and proudly on display. A small curated array of bottles that quietly announces the people living here know how to entertain properly and how to genuinely enjoy themselves. Offering a guest a drink the moment they walk through the door counts as simple good manners, and the guest accepting counts as simply the done thing. And the whole social choreography of the evening assumes drinking as the natural medium in which adults gather together, in more or less the same way it assumes ordinary conversation. The gatherings themselves really are genuinely lovely, and it would be dishonest to paint them any other way. Neighbors come together under the warm patio lights on summer evenings, glasses in hand, cigarettes glowing gently in the dark, laughter carrying easily across the yards. There's real warmth in all of it, real community. Real pleasure taken in the easy company of good friends at the close of a long working week. This is genuinely how the adults of this neighborhood come to know and enjoy one another, and a good deal of it is honestly good. But there's a quieter current running steadily underneath all of it too, and honesty asks that we name it plainly, without either scolding anyone or looking away entirely. In a culture where heavy drinking is this completely normal, this thoroughly woven into every single occasion, and this entirely unquestioned by anyone around, the line between simple social enjoyment and genuine dependence grows very hard to make out clearly, and remarkably easy to cross without anyone at all, including yourself, quite noticing it happen. When everyone at the party is drinking at every single gathering, the person who's quietly come to actually need the drink looks exactly like everybody else standing around them, and the need hides comfortably in plain sight the whole time. And so, for a fair number of people in this neighborhood, the cheerful ritual shades quietly, gradually, into something considerably heavier. A genuine reliance dressed up carefully in the friendly costume of sociability, a way of numbing the day's accumulated pressure that wears, on the surface, the entirely innocent look of celebration. The same culture that offers no real language for burnout, and no real framework at all for the quiet strain of that tidy, well-kept life, does offer, everywhere and always, a drink, and a great many people take it up gladly, and then in time find that it has quietly taken them up in return. The driving home afterward closes the loop with an earlier chapter of this same story, the whole evening's gathering ending with people climbing behind the wheel in a state the era shrugs off entirely, and which later decades will come to find genuinely alarming. One more small consequence, folded quietly into the general fun. It's simply part of the same easy, unquestioning attitude running through everything. Drink freely, drive home after, think nothing further about it. So you raise your glass right along with everyone else under the warm patio lights, the ice clinking pleasantly, the laughter coming easy, and nobody at all is keeping count. And that quietly was rather the entire point of the evening. And as the decade wears steadily on, this same comfortable relationship with numbing life's edges leaves the whole culture quietly unguarded against a newer, sharper visitor altogether, one that arrives wearing an even more respectable disguise than anything that came before it. Chapter 24. The Visitor in the Nice Suit. Let's address something the sitcoms of the era never once showed, and let's do it soberly. As the decade wears on, a certain drug quietly slips out of the shadows and straight into offices, into dinner parties, into finished basements, wearing a nice suit and calling itself success. It gets marketed by nobody in particular, and simultaneously by everybody at once, as the fuel of the truly ambitious, the confident, the winning. It arrives in genuinely respectable neighborhoods with two-car garages, a very long way from the image the evening news generally prefers to broadcast. Families crack quietly apart behind drawn curtains. Careers and entire savings accounts quietly evaporate. There is nothing remotely funny in the wreckage it leaves behind, so we won't pretend otherwise for a second. It's simply part of the true, honest story of this era, a dark thread running steadily underneath the bright suburban surface, and it deserves to be told entirely straight. I'll keep the whole of this chapter steady and plain throughout, because it's a chapter with real victims in it and no comedy whatsoever, and it would be genuinely wrong to reach for a light line anywhere inside it. The thing worth understanding here is how the drug actually presented itself, because the presentation was really the whole trap. This was not a substance that arrived looking like ruin from the start. It arrived looking like ambition, like pure energy, like the small edge that separated the winners from everybody else standing around them. And that particular disguise let it walk straight through doors that would have been firmly slammed shut on anything that looked genuinely dangerous from the outset. It attaches itself to the culture of success running through this whole decade, to the striving, upwardly mobile, work hard and win ethos that runs so strongly through nearly everything. It promises confidence, sharpness, real stamina, the ability to keep going and to stay firmly ahead of the pack. And it sells that particular promise not primarily to the people the evening news likes to feature in its warning segments, but to working professionals, to people with good steady jobs and nice homes and every single outward marker of having genuinely made it. It becomes, for a stretch, associated with a certain kind of glamour, a certain fast-moving image of success. And that association is exactly what makes it so effective and so quietly destructive. And so it finds its way into settings that consider themselves entirely respectable and fully immune to anything like this. Into offices, passed quietly among people in tailored suits, into dinner parties, into the finished basements and rec rooms of perfectly comfortable homes, into neighborhoods with manicured lawns and 2 cars sitting in every single garage. It does not stay confined to the shadows this culture prefers to imagine it locked away in. It moves straight into the same tidy houses this whole story has been walking through from the very beginning, and it settles in quietly behind the drawn curtains. The damage it does there is severe, and it's hidden, which turns out to be a genuinely terrible combination, because the surface has to be maintained at all costs, since the entire suburban compact runs at bottom on appearances. The real harm happens entirely out of sight, behind good manners and closed drapes. Families quietly come apart. The strain and the secrecy and the steadily deepening need all play out in private, entirely invisible from the curb, while the lawn stays perfectly mowed, and the family photo stays right there on the mantle, and the material cost turns out to be genuinely ruinous in its own right. Careers that people had spent decades carefully building come apart. Savings drain steadily away. The comfortable prosperity a family has slowly assembled, the cars, the house, the whole visible dream can be quietly hollowed out and lost entirely, and often is, while the neighbors remain none the wiser right up until the very end, if they ever find out at all. The wreckage here is real and financial and deeply personal and lasting, and it falls on people who genuinely believed, right up until it was already too late, that this was something that only happened to other kinds of people, somewhere else entirely. There's nothing to redeem in the telling of it. No ironic angle waiting anywhere, no dry punchline sitting at the end, and I won't manufacture one here just for effect. It's simply a true and dark part of what this decade actually was, running steadily underneath the bright, cheerful surface. This whole story keeps lifting up to look beneath. The suburbs were sold as a genuine refuge from exactly this kind of thing. And for a great many families, they turned out not to be one at all. And that particular gap between the promise and the reality is really the whole quiet tragedy sitting at the center of it. So we tell it plainly here, and we leave it plainly too, with real respect for the people and the families it broke, one quiet household at a time. And in that same spirit of looking honestly at the harder parts of this story, let's follow the youngest members of these households out the door each morning, into an institution that ran, in this decade, on rules a later era would firmly reconsider from the ground up. Chapter 25. School, a place of learning and light corporal punishment. Let's send the kids off to school now, a place of genuine learning, and on occasion, some fairly serious corporal punishment. The wooden paddle hangs right there on the wall in a good number of classrooms. A real object, with a real and clearly understood purpose. And being sent down to the principal's office could mean genuine physical discipline, sanctioned openly by everyone involved in the whole arrangement. The school buildings themselves quite often hold the very same asbestos and lead lurking back home in the family house. Recess plays out as a genuine contact sport, staged entirely on asphalt, and the nurse's office dispenses little more than a cot to lie on and a firm suggestion to simply walk it off. Nobody wears a helmet for anything at all. You memorize your times tables, you dodge a rubber ball thrown with real, serious intent, and you learn fairly early on that the adult world enforces its rules with a considerably heavier hand than later history books will approve of. The paddle is really the detail that stops a modern listener cold, so let's take it plainly and without flinching. In a great many schools across the country, physical discipline is not some vague rumor or forgotten relic. It's a standing, official policy and the instrument of it. A wooden paddle hangs in plain view in the school office or right at the front of the classroom, functioning as both a practical tool and a standing warning. Being sent down to see the principal isn't merely some minor administrative event. It can mean a genuine, physical consequence, delivered by an adult carrying the full sanction of the school behind them, and very often carrying the enthusiastic backing of the parents waiting back home too, who might well promise a second round of the same if word of it happened to get back to them first. This is simply how authority functions in this world, and children absorb the whole arrangement fairly early on. The threat of it hangs over the entire school day, a real and physical stake sitting behind the posted rules, and it shapes behavior through a particular kind of fear that a later era will look back on and firmly decide against. It's a heavier note than this chapter's usual tone, so I'll simply mark it honestly here and move on, because it was a genuine and real feature of the place, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the actual history of it. The buildings themselves, meanwhile, carry the very same hidden hazards as the houses these children have come from each morning. The same asbestos wrapped around the same kinds of pipes, sitting in the same kinds of ceiling tiles, lying under the same kinds of flooring. The same lead lurks in the same kind of glossy old paint on the same style of window frames. The school gets built and maintained by the exact same era, carrying the exact same blind spots, and so this place of learning quietly carries the same invisible chemistry as home. And nobody there knows any better than anybody else does, anywhere. Recess is where the day's real physics lessons genuinely happen, played out on a stretch of asphalt offering all the give of a parking lot, because a parking lot is, more or less, exactly what it is. The games themselves run rough, contact is fully expected, and the ground beneath everyone's feet is entirely unforgiving, and skinned knees and scraped palms serve as the ordinary daily currency of the schoolyard. Dodgeball, in particular, reads less like a game and more like a fully sanctioned opportunity to hurl a hard rubber ball at a classmate with real velocity and real intent behind it. And it is genuinely beloved, and it teaches a certain sharp alertness that stays with a person for years afterward. And when the inevitable happens, when someone goes down hard on the asphalt or takes a ball straight to the face or turns an ankle badly, the destination is always the nurse's office, which offers a level of medical care best described, generously, as symbolic. There's a cot available to lie down on. There's perhaps an ice pack and a bandage. And above all, there's this era's universal medical philosophy, delivered with brisk, cheerful kindness, that you should simply get up, shake it off, and walk it off, an approach applied with more or less equal confidence to a minor scraped knee and to what was, in at least a few cases, very possibly a mild concussion. Nobody wears any kind of protective gear for anything at all, of course. Not on the bike ride to school in the morning, not out on the playground, not during the rougher games, not anywhere at all. The helmet, as a normal, everyday object of ordinary childhood, still belongs entirely to some future decade. Kids simply move through a hard, unforgiving physical world with bare heads and bare knees, learning its edges the direct way, in much the same manner they learn the edges of the backyard, by running straight into them. And so the school day amounts to a full immersion in this whole era's overall approach, its real learning sitting right alongside its heavy hand, its hidden hazard sitting right alongside its rough playground and its walk-it-off medicine. All of it delivered with total, unquestioned confidence, and absorbed by the children living through it as simply the way the world has always worked. You do your times tables. You dodge the ball when it comes flying at you. You keep half an eye on the paddle hanging by the office door. And you come home each afternoon having genuinely learned quite a lot, some of it even from the actual lessons. Closing, the whole tidy dream held gently. And so our long night here in the suburbs comes gently to its close. What a strange and genuinely lovely and thoroughly complicated place this turned out to be, that green and tidy dream of the 1980s. From the outside, it looked entirely perfect. The immaculate lawns, the gleaming cars sitting in every driveway, the warm glow spilling out of every window, the whole complete picture of a life that had finally, wonderfully arrived. And you walked through the whole of it tonight, room by room, and found something quieter and more genuinely human tucked in behind every single polished surface. You breathed the soft blue haze that hung in every room of the house. You ate the beige and neon breakfast, and drank the orange drink that had never once actually met an orange. You wore the flammable optimism of the era, rode unbuckled in the boat-sized car, and mowed the single most poisoned patch of ground for 100 feet in any direction. You let yourself into an empty house each afternoon with a key worn on a string around your neck. You worshipped the sun, chased the perfect tan, and stood beneath a sky that everyone quietly understood might not always hold. And you saw, too, the heavier things, the ones held alone behind drawn curtains, the silences that the whole perfect surface quietly required of everyone living beneath it. It's easy, looking back now, to either only laugh at all of it or only wince. But the truer thing to do is hold it all at once, the way it genuinely was, because the people who actually lived through this were doing their honest best, inside a world that simply hadn't yet learned what it didn't yet know. They loved their families in those wood-paneled rooms. They found real joy on Saturday mornings, and real warmth gathered under the patio lights on summer evenings. They built something they genuinely believed in, and a great deal of it really was good. And they cannot fairly be blamed for the invisible things nobody had thought yet to warn them about. That's the quiet gift of looking back honestly, really. Not to feel any sense of superiority over people who came before us, but to feel a real gratitude and a bit of tenderness toward the people who lived just ahead of us in time and carried what they carried without the words or the tools or the knowledge we happen to have now. They didn't know, not really, about the air or the ground beneath their feet or that small orange bottle behind the bathroom mirror. And they lived anyway, cheerfully, stubbornly, beautifully, and handed the whole thing forward to us, a little bit safer than they'd found it themselves. So tonight, as you settle into your own quiet room, with your cleaner air and your safer car, and your more open, honest way of nomming the harder things out loud, maybe spare a soft thought for that gleaming, complicated old neighborhood and the good people sleeping quietly inside it. They waved at each other from a careful distance, sealed away in their identical houses, lonelier than they ever quite let on. And they were doing just fine. And they were doing their honest best. And both of those things, somehow, were always true at exactly the same time. The streetlights hum now over an empty road. The televisions have gone dark, one window at a time, all down the block. The whole tidy dream lies still and peaceful beneath a patient, watching sky. And there's nothing left for you to do tonight except let your shoulders finally sink down. Let your breathing slow, all the way down. And let the long, quiet night carry you gently down into rest. Sleep well, the whole neighborhood is sleeping too, and everything for now is soft and dark and still.